The 540 is brought to you by StarCityGames.com's weekly sale. Head on over to StarCityGames.com/sale because this week you can save 15% off of all Magic the Gathering promo cards. From now until November 7th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time, you can get 15% off all Magic promo cards. And let me tell you, promo cards are a massive, massive category in all of Magic, and of course, on our website. So if you're looking for extra secret layers you may have missed the first time around, maybe some of those sweet Planar Chaos reverse color shifted F&M promos or anything else in between, this is the time to do it. 15% off is a huge sale, and this is a great opportunity to get some of those sweet, awesome looking cards for your cube or commander deck or modern deck. Check it out over on StarCityGames.com/sale until this Sunday, November 7th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll see you there.
What's up, everybody? Cedric Phillips here, stopping by real quick to let you know about one of Star City Games' newest podcasts, The Receivables, hosted by yours truly, alongside my partner in crime, of course, Patrick Sullivan, where the two of us discuss Magic sets, both past and present, from top to bottom. On every episode of The Receivables, you're going to hear us talk about the facts of a set, the mechanics of a set, the cycles of a set, you know, the boring stuff, before we get into some crazy stories of when we were playing Magic during the times that the set was legal. We've got a ridiculous award show where we give out awards like the Char Rumbler Award for weirdest card in a set, the Oko Thief of Crowns Award for best card in the set, and a whole bunch more. Before we finally decide, hey, what card won the set and what letter grade should we give the set? It's a whole lot of fun. We're having a blast recording them. Hopefully you have the opportunity to listen to it and you enjoy it as much as we're enjoying recording them. Where can you find it? StarCityGames.com or wherever else you listen to your podcast. The Receivables every single week here at SCG.
The 540 is also brought to you by Coalesce Apparel and Design. Head over to coalesceapparel.shop and use gift code SCG at checkout to save 10% off your entire order. If you want to rep the coolest Magic the Gathering themed hoodies and t-shirts or stickers, head over to coalesceapparel.shop. Maybe you want to rep our fallen friend Golos with the Tireless Pilgrim versus the Multiverse shirt, or maybe you're Wooburg Forever and you want to go with the South Beach collection. Any way you want to do it. Anti-Mulligan Mulligan Club, we got you. MTG Jam, of course. And all of the Keeping It 100 line, there for you. coalesceapparel.shop. Use gift code SCG at checkout for 10% off your entire order. Nobody made what they wanted, so they made it themselves. Welcome back, one and all, to the 540. And look, I'm not going to spend too much time on intros today because this is our very first mailbag episode, and we have a lot to get to. I, of course, am Justin Parnell. You can find me at jparnell1 on Twitter, and my co-host, who is going to have all the answers today.
I'm Ryan Overturf. You can find me at Ryan Overdrive on Twitter. I was kind of hoping we were going to share the responsibility on that one, but I'll do my best.
I'll see what I can do. You know, we've set it up to where, in this case, you're like, you know, if we're a commentator team, you're more of the expert and I'm more of the play-by-play, just barely. So in this scenario, I can just rely completely on you for your expertise and just sit back and just kind of steer the ship aimlessly.
That is why I ultimately moved over to play-by-play, doing live commentary. So I respect the angle.
Yeah, of course. Gotta have one. Look, I just know what mine is. Anyway, we've asked you out there in listener land for the last month to send us questions for our very first mailbag episode of the 540. And I'm actually very proud to say that you all did it. You actually came through with flying colors because we have a plethora of questions that we're going to be going through today.
Yeah, we got quite a lot. Really happy with that response. Thank you to everybody who posted a question, and hopefully we have an answer that you like.
Yeah, you know, we have a lot of questions today. We have a lot of a variation of questions too, and I will say that one thing that I'm going to try to do is I've posted these questions in here, and a lot of people, especially on Twitter,
commented that they really love the podcast and they're really happy that we're doing this. And I want to say that I appreciate all of you that have told us how much that you enjoy us doing the show, how much you've enjoyed listening to it, how much it's helped you in your cubing journey, and that's awesome. And honestly, I'll speak for Ryan too and say that we really, really appreciate that. That means a lot to us. However, I have cut some of that off on some of these questions just for time because we have so many. So just know that if I don't read your entire question where you thank us, I did see it and I appreciate you.
Yep. Definitely read those sentiments. Appreciate those greatly. Save some time on the podcast and not reiterate them every time we answer.
Yes. So we appreciate you for appreciating us. So thank you very much. All right, Ryan, are you ready to get into it?
Let's do it.
All right. So getting started, we're going to hit the YouTube first. I got a bunch of YouTube questions. So Jamie Anderson from YouTube asked, when cubing, is there a pet card that you always need in your cube or that you will always draft and force? Some of mine were Moat and Assemble the Legion in cubes I've drafted.
I actually really enjoy reading this question because the examples there's a card that I adore and a card that I abhor.
I feel the same.
Like Moat is kind of a big example, maybe one of the most egregious gameplay experiences for Magic cards in the history of the game. And then Assemble Legion is a card that I played a lot in Standard. I really enjoy. So it does make me happy to see it in cubes. Personally, yeah, I have a lot of cubes now. I've really increased the number of cubes that I own when I started working on Tuberts. So I tend to not do too much overlap, and the overlap in them tends to be just really nuts and bolt functional stuff. When I think of a pet card in cube, though, I think of Tombstone Stairwell in Spooky Cube, which is a card that just everybody loves. I'm not going to give you the text on that one, even though you probably don't know it, because it is kind of lengthy and kind of wonky. But it's one that my friends are always excited to see, that I'm always excited to see, and does not usually post a very good record in the draft.
I feel you on that. I think I have a couple that kind of fit into this category. I will say that the cards are slightly better than Tombstone Stairwell. So a card that I always need in my cube, Fact or Fiction, will always be in every cube I ever make, unless I'm making a pauper cube where it's all commons. Also, want to give a shout out to my friend Anthony Avitolo, who actually just wrote an article that came out on cubecobra.com that's all about Fact or Fiction, kind of the history of Fact or Fiction, especially as it relates to cube, which is really awesome. So it's very timely for this answer. So that's always one. That's the one I always need in my cube. Always, 100% of the time, will always have Fact or Fiction. And the one that I always try to force is Goblin Bombardment. If it's in a cube, I'm going to try to draft it.
Those are two good ones for sure.
Yep. All right, what's next?
So we have kind of a couple questions that were of pretty similar nature here. Thunderbird Jack on YouTube asked, thoughts on adding rare lands like Shocks to a Peasant cube to encourage 2-color aggro decks? And Del Gabo on Twitter had a pretty similar question, just generally about adding rares to rarity restricted cubes. And what are your thoughts on that, Justin?
So, I've actually said, a little bit ago on this podcast, we weren't actually talking about Peasant or Pauper cubes at the time, but I was remarking how I wish the Theros Scry lands were uncommons because I feel like that's their power level, and I think that people should be, putting them in their uncommon having cubes. It's kind of tough because this is not something that we actually talked about for those two episodes when we talked about oh my god, I'm combining the two words, Pauper and Peasant. But I really encourage people to break rarity restrictions early and often, because ultimately the restriction is always self-imposed, right? Any restriction that you're putting on your cube is a self-imposed restriction. There's not a rule that is there any governing body that's forcing you to do that other than yourself. So if you feel like you are going to increase the playability of an archetype or a thing in your cube by breaking whatever self-imposed restriction you have, I think you should just do it. And this goes for all cubes, not just for Peasant and Pauper cubes. I will say that sometimes it might take a little bit of calibrating to get that right. Shock lands are significantly more powerful than any land that has ever been in any pauper or peasant cube. But I like where your head's at. So I would just say to make sure that when you are kind of going outside of that rule that you've created for yourself or whatever cube you have, to make sure that the things you're adding aren't being too different in the context of the cube or the power level of the rest of the cards in that cube. And I know that doesn't exactly answer your specific question, but I think it's my answer for the entire context of what you're asking.
Yeah, I'll definitely echo that sentiment. Your cube, your rules. I do like that idea of shock land specifically for aggressive decks. That makes sense. And also, I mean, I think that when it comes to just a lot of archetype specific stuff, the full-on rarity restriction is going to push you in a very specific direction. If you listen to our episode about peasant cubes, a lot of it is about attrition-based gameplay, generating value. And you can just open up different spaces and more types of different play environments when you lift those restrictions. So find the balance that's right for you, definitely.
Yeah, shock lands, they help aggro decks in both directions, right?
Yes.
Help you get on the board earlier and help reduce your opponent's life total over the course of a draft. So that is definitely a positive for that. All right. David Hutkowski on YouTube asked, non-land cycles. Should you include full cycles of original Titans if there's 3 in the cube? Are there any cycles balanced or powerful enough to include a full cycle of?
Oh, there almost certainly are, especially if you're talking about different power levels of cubes. When you specifically talk about the mythic rare Titans, there is quite a bit of disparity in those ones. And if you look at the original Tubert, I do have all 3 Grixis Titans. Then I have a different green card and then a different white card for the 6 drops there. And that's going to kind of be the nature of kind of most cycles as we're talking about printed cards and sets. If you look at the Lorwyn commands, Cryptic Command, very powerful. Primal commands in a lot of cubes, but just not nearly on the same level. I would defy most players to tell me what Incendiary Command does. And then Austere Command is like a big commander card. Profane Command, I think, is actually kind of reasonable for cube. It doesn't really show up in the year 2021. I think that also kind of the nature when you get into those cycles, at least when it comes to the Titans, they all cost the same. Everything looks really similar. But then a lot of cycles do end up breaking down like the commands, where the casting costs are different. Some are instants, some are sorceries. So I think that really my idea for cycles in cube is you have a specific thing that you want each color to have. It could be something like your own just cycle of 1-drops or 3-drops or whatever. Like I want every color to have something of this nature. It's kind of nice to have full cycles because when you see a card in a printed cycle, especially if you're into traditional limited, you kind of naturally think about the other cards maybe being in the environment. But balance is often pretty off when it comes to a very closed environment like cube.
Yeah, very much so. So I have 3 notes here. The first note is 3 red sorcery. Deal 4 damage to a player. Deal 2 damage to each creature. Everyone does a wheel, like a Winds of Change. To discard their hand and draw that many, or destroy non-basic land. I'm not 100% sure of the order, but I think that's it.
Yeah.
2. A big level up moment for me personally in my cubing journey was eschewing the fact that I had to have cycles. I started cubing shortly after Lorwyn came out. That was actually the newest set when I played cube for the first time. And when I first built my cube, I had all of the Titans that you're talking about, that David is talking about in the question, as well as all the Lorwyn commands. Ryan outlined all of those things perfectly because that's exactly where my mind went too. I think it's really important to evaluate all the cards in a cycle when you see that some of them are clearly cubable. But I think it's really even more important to not be beholden to have to including that entire cycle. Because you're ultimately going to create a scenario where you have cards that are pulling their weight in that cycle, and then you have cards that are not, but they might be buoyed by the fact that they are essentially part of a same cycle with more powerful cards. And those cards ultimately become dead weight in your cube, but it becomes more difficult to cut them because you're like, I don't want to break the cycle. Getting out of that mindset is actually really important, just from a design standpoint. And it's very different for Wizards of the Coast making a cycle than a cube designer making a cycle, because you have access to more things. You're not, again, self-imposed restrictions, and you should just make sure that you avoid that. Are there any cycles balanced or powerful enough to include? Yes. I think cycles in cube are the naturally occurring ones, like that we mentioned specifically, like the commands and the titans, are less powerful, or excuse me, less important than the ones that you kind of make on your own, which Ryan also nailed, talking about like, I have you saying you had 5 Titan-like creatures, even though not all 3 of, or not 2 of them were not the actual Titans that completed that cycle. So you made your own cycle for the cube, and that is the exact thing that I would suggest to everyone else, to kind of evaluate that space that they're filling, but say, is this the best card to do it? Sometimes it's going to be the full cycle, and sometimes it's not, but more creating the cycle in your cube rather than using the entire cycle as it was printed.
Definitely.
Boom.
All right, our next question is from Amelia Arnold. It was posted on YouTube as well. Actually, I skipped one. Charles Gould on YouTube. We'll go there next. When supporting archetypes in cube, how many cards on average would you include to support said archetypes so that there isn't too much favoritism? In a similar vein, how much of a split between creatures and non-creature spells should be represented in each color? And last note from Charles, also note there are significantly less cards for aggro and Commander Legends set, and wondering if this was designed so that decks would start at the mid-range for decks. So these are all fairly similar things. This is just kind of asking at the math of cube breakdowns for archetypes, creatures versus non-creatures. And I think that these are all very similar, very related answers for these questions.
Yeah, I'm gonna go backwards first. Talking about aggro cards, the reason aggro cards are Commander Legends, aggressive decks are actually notoriously difficult to support in Commander in general, but are doubly so in multiplayer limited. You have basically every factor working against you. You have a singleton nature. You have 3 opponents instead of 1, and their life totals are all higher. So it's really, really hard. You'd have to work really, really hard and make some really interesting design decisions to make aggro good in any multiplayer cube. And that's just honestly just going to be the case. I'm not saying it can't happen, but that's going to be more about addition from subtraction and not including cards than specifically including the aggro cards. Because it's just, look, even if you're only working with like 30 life, or if you're only working with 20 life, you still, as the aggressive player, have to take down 60 life total points rather than 20, and it's tough to do. Split between creatures and non-creatures, honestly, I think in a lot of cubes they're played to those color strengths. You're gonna have the least creatures in blue, you're probably gonna have the most in white or green. This doesn't necessarily have to be the case, but because most cubes are trying to play to specific color strengths just historically, and I'm kind of excluding like really specific cubes, like if you have a cube that is about like a certain set or a certain block of sets, or you're trying to like go in the opposite direction and say, oh, these are like interesting things that this color can do, but it's not super well supported. That could change the dynamic of the creatures and non-creatures. So I don't think it's important to keep it even, certainly, because if you're trying to say, oh, I got 60 cards in each section for my cube. Let's say you have a 540 card cube. You have 65 cards. You don't want to say, well, I would need 40 creatures across every single color, because it's going to be really easy for white and green to get there. It's going to be really difficult for blue to get there. So you start creating a disparity because you're kind of forcing yourself into not playing by the color strength as much as possible. This kind of goes the same for archetypes. Some archetypes need more support and some archetypes need less, or adversely, and this is probably more common, some archetypes have cards that work with a lot of other decks or are just good cards on their own. Ryan and I talked about these spells matter archetypes. Well, that's one that you actually end up with a lot of support for, but that's because cards Ponder, Preordain, Consider, Opt, these are all cards that are just good cards that a lot of decks are going to have. And those cards, you want to make sure there's a density of them to support that spells matter archetype. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're exclusively for that, because even if you wanted that to be the case, when you get into a drafting scenario, your drafters don't care what you intended. They're just going to draft the best cards they feel like are going to make their decks the best. Mm-hmm. So favoritism is tough because it is possible to push as hard as you can on something and really force it down your drafters' throats. Sometimes that works out because it's an archetype that you need more support over, like any green-white archetype, literally any of them.
Yes.
Or like another one that I've messed around with for years now, and I've never felt like I've gotten right, is like a red-green lands archetype. And you need more support, like more really specific support for cards that don't fit into other decks. But then you have this disparity of if this doesn't get picked up as an archetype in the draft, you have all of these cards left over that are going to go 13th through 15th pick. So it's a very delicate balance, and you have to constantly be looking for cards for those archetypes, not just new cards, but cards that just exist over the history of Magic, to try to strike a balance between, is this powerful enough to even support? Am I providing enough support in the cube? Am I providing too much support where I'm forcing my drafters to do this because this is clearly the thing I have to do to be able to have a successful deck in this cube? And then again, if it fails, you end up with a lot of leftovers at the end of the draft. So it's a tough balance. And I know that's a lot of answers to your questions, but hopefully that was helpful. Ryan, maybe you have something a little more succinct than I do.
Yeah, well, let's make this longer. So the two thoughts I always have in my mind working on a cube list are, I'm asking myself the questions: what do the decks look like? What do the games look like? And that second question, what do the games look like, does inform what do the decks look like. And that's going to play into the split. Justin mentioned specifically blue wants more non-creature spells than creatures. Because what do the games look like? Well, the blue deck is trying to have inevitability generally when you have some really big flashy spells, either generating card advantage, using counter spells, some big over-the-top thing to try to close the game. None of this stuff makes you want to play a fiddly creature in your deck. And so you just stop putting those cards in your deck to the extent that is possible. So your cube really shouldn't represent cards that nobody wants to play. So what do the decks look like? And then what do the games look like? So when you talk about archetype favoritism, and again, this does tie right to what do the decks look like, you do kind of want to have an idea of what the ideal version is. And then this kind of breaks down not so much in volume of cards, but in terms of the most powerful cards supporting an archetype. Because if you're trying to make an archetype work in a color, and the best card for that archetype is just firmly worse than some of the generically good cards, it's just not going to show up in decks. The decks just aren't going to look like that. If you want to make Delver of Secrets work in your cube, I don't really want to put Delver of Secrets in my Cryptic Command Mystic Confluence deck. It's just not going to make the cut. It's unrealistic. It's the worst card in my deck every time. So you keep those things in mind. Your split should be based on kind of having ideal versions of decks that line up in interesting and compelling ways, and just not including the stuff that's bad. I think that a lot of people frame it and trying to include the things that are good. I think it's just as important to not include the things that are bad.
Yep, that's how you end up with those 13, 14, 15 picks coming around the table every draft.
Yeah.
All right, moving on to Amelia Arnold from YouTube asks, are there alternate win condition cards, specifically cards with the printed text "you win the game," healthy for an average Legacy cube? Bonus question. I love the card game Flux, and I'm brainstorming ideas to build a Tubert cube, vintage, powered, and proxied with a bunch of nonsense chaos enchantments, alternate win conditions, and combos. Do you have any suggestions on constructing the cube or any fun cards to include?
So, love the concept. I'll get to that in a second. For the first question, are there healthy cards with the text "you win the game"? And I think that you'll more often find that the cards are just not nearly good enough. When I think of cards that have that text "you win the game" off the top of my head, I am usually drawn first to the cycle from Odyssey, including Battle of Wits, an obvious non-starter for Cube. You're never going to have 200 cards in your Cube draft deck. Chance Encounters, similarly a non-starter. Don't see too much coin flipping in games of Magic. You can maybe put some other stuff in there, like Mortal Kombat, counting creatures in graveyard, and was it Test of Endurance is the right one? You want 50 life, I'm pretty sure. These are all just kind of unreasonable asks. There's just so many ways to win the game before you meet these conditions, or to just not care about the conditions. Coalition Victory is another one that comes to mind. And any deck that could somewhat consistently meet those criteria would not have difficulty winning games otherwise in most Cube environments. The one card that I think of when I think of a game-winning kind of card that is kind of interesting, though very specific, is Mirrodin Besieged from Modern Horizons. It actually has the text "target player loses the game," but that's basically the same thing.
Arguably better text than "you win the game."
Right. It checks on having 15 artifacts in your graveyard to do that. But the thing I like about that one is the modal card. And it has the other text where if you cast an artifact, you make a 1/1 mirror. That's also very specific in the same way. So I don't know if that's necessarily going to fit into your cube, but it's just an example of a card that has some charming elements to it. The fact that it does something else, I think is what would drive it for inclusion. And then regarding a Tubert that is inspired by the card game Flux, if you're not familiar with the game Flux, I have not played it extensively, but it's a game where you play cards and they change the rules of the game. So just all kinds of stuff. So imagine you're playing a game of Magic. Suddenly your maximum hand size changes. Maybe the turn order is reversed. Just stuff like that. Maybe you can play 2 lands a turn now. Honestly, I just had this thought right now. I had a different answer, but I mean, if you want to make a Flux-like cube, you can just make a cube that supports Plane Chase. That's kind of a Magic product that exists that is not too different from Flux. There are a number of rule-setting cards throughout the history of Magic. We talked about Moat a little bit ago, and unfortunately, many of the rule-setting cards are similarly miserable. I don't think people are going to have fun playing your Trinisphere cube. There are some fun ones. I think I would bias towards Can over Can't. Something like Helm of Awakening that reduces the cost of all spells by 1 is a lot more fun than Sphere of Resistance, which increases the cost of the spells by 1. And it sounds like when you use the words nonsense chaos enchantments, I mean, the first card I think of is In the Eye of Chaos, which counters spells unless you pay additional costs. That stuff I don't think is fun. Maybe it's fun for you, but I do not have actionable advice if that's what your intention is.
I think, yeah, I appreciate the concept, but I guess just know that what you're going to be creating is a novelty thing where people will, and okay, I'll take a step back. You could be, if I were designing the cube, I did not believe enough in my design ability to create a cube with the idea that you were putting together with a bunch of the alternate win conditions, combos, and such, where I could create a cube environment that people would want to continually come back to and play multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that it's not worth doing, because that's a hell of an experience. And I talk about cube as an experience a lot on this show. And that is one that when someone drafts, they will always remember. And there's definitely something to be said for that.
For sure.
Beyond that, yeah, I pretty much agree with Ryan. I think most of the alternate win condition cards are just like not good enough. Thousands Oracle is probably just the best one, I would imagine. Yeah. Obviously, the card is a staple in multiple formats that it's legal in. So, but other than that, I think after Thassa's Oracle, it drops off pretty significantly for playable cards. So I would say for the average healthy legacy cube, no. I just pretty much flat out say no. That in my opinion, that those are not
good inclusions. Thassa's Oracle aside, maybe, but you also have to really want your players to desire a really specific type of game for that to occur as well.
That was a good call on Thassa's Oracle. That's like by far the best one. I just blanked on it because I think there's so many. There's a long history of bad ones.
Yeah, they're all. You mean all of the rest? I think you got the second best one, which is probably Mirrored and Besieged. I think I agree with that too. Okay. All right. So we're going to take a quick break here. We've gone on for a little bit. We have many more questions, but we have to pay the bills, as you all know. So we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, more of your questions. Look, we're all Magic players here, so I know you're probably like me. And you have some extra cards that are hanging around that you would love to sell for cash or maybe trade in for some more cards. Well, if you're looking to sell or trade your Magic the Gathering cards, it has literally never been easier. Visit StarCityGames.com/sell with a 30% store credit trade-in bonus and the fastest turnaround time in the industry. There is no reason to sell to anybody else. We have 4 convenient ways to sell your cards to us. 1, check out our buy list. You can find out exactly what we're paying for each of your cards individually right now. That too much work? Number 2, check out our ship and sell program. Put your cards in a box, tape it up, send it to us. We'll do the rest of the work. Or if you're passing through Roanoke, Virginia, come visit Star City Comics and Games, and we can sit down with a buyer and work out a trade right there in the store. Or if you might be a store and you're looking to offload bulk and you have over 500,000 cards you're looking to sell, we can come to you. Any of the ways that you want to work with us, go to StarCityGames.com/sell. That's SELL right now for more information.
Welcome back, everybody. Continuing along with our first mailbag episode on the 540. Our next question comes from YouTube, posted by Ian Braverman. Ian owns a peasant cube and was wondering what our opinions are on overarching archetypes. For example, my cube has a cycling overarching theme to it across all 5 colors. Sometimes people draft it and it's really fun, and none of the cycling cards are bad on their own, but people sometimes complain that some of the cycling cards could be replaced by other better cards. What are your thoughts on this? Some of the cycling payoffs include things like Astral Slide and Lightning Rift.
This is a really interesting question. I actually do not think that I have made a single archetype that is comprehensive of all 5 of the colors. However, upon considering this a little bit, I think that a problem with this would be a similar problem to what we were talking about a little bit earlier with supporting archetypes, in that if you have something accessible to all 5 colors, especially cycling, the good cards are going to be drafted irrelevant of the archetype you were trying to support. So the person that might be trying to do the Astral Slide Lightning Rift deck may be able to get those cards and some cycling cards that are not generally playable, because all of the generally playable cycling cards are going to go to other drafters. And this is not 100% of the case, but I would imagine that in most cases, splitting things across that wide of a scope in your cube means that the best cards are going to rise to the top and the worst cards are probably going to become some of the undraftables, and the archetype that you might be trying to support over 5 colors might not be realized as frequently. So honestly, I would actually really like to play a cube that has that type of support over a 5-color archetype. I think that would be really cool. But I've not personally seen it, and that's kind of just what I'm envisioning would happen in that scenario.
Yeah, I like the idea. It sounds like Ian is suggesting there's kind of the opposite problem having here. If some players are saying some of those cycling cards should just be other better cards, it sounds like there's issue with maybe there's so much volume that you get to some cards that nobody really wants to play with cycling. That's an issue you can run into with cycling. If you have a card in your cube and the idea is you're just supposed to cycle it, that's not very fun. We're talking about Whispers of the Muse again, right?
Hey.
Without any of the
Whispers
good,
of the Muse podcast.
but you're not casting an instant or a sorcery. Doesn't
Yeah,
have
it's
all
true.
the charm. Yeah,
It doesn't.
like-
It can't buy it back either. Can't take it
Yeah.
with you.
I do really like the idea. An example of a theme that does really kind of go into all 5 colors. There's kind of just more stuff in Magic. They've been working kind of more and more on making things overlap in that way. But I think Delirium is a good all 5 color mechanic, but doesn't really encompass so much of the cube. I think cycling has to take up a really high volume of your spells. And you get into both a problem Justin outlined, where the really good ones just are played as individual cards, and then the problem I outlined, where the really bad ones are in there just to be cycled, and that's not very fun or interesting either. So I do like the idea of the overarching archetype. I think cycling is a bit ambitious. It's something that I've tried on paper and have kind of been pretty dissatisfied, more so on the cards that you only cycle kind of front. The well only runs so deep. But stuff that is a little bit more seamless, that just has some payoffs in all the colors and some different ways to set up in all 5 colors. Delirium being the example I really like. It is a good thing to do.
Yeah. All right. Well said, Ryan. All right. Rincharo MTG on YouTube asks, my question is, how do you guys handle flip cards when it comes to sleeving and having flip cards in a cube? Such as Search for Azcanta or any of the new werewolves. Do you have the sleeves just normally in the cube with the rest of the cards? Or do you seek out the checklist cards, use blank cards from within the card, etc.? I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on how to approach these.
Yeah, so we've talked about sleeves on the podcast before. I think we definitely did on the logistics episode. I make a point to use opaque sleeves. I'm a Dragon Shield black matte guy. You can't see through them, so I just put the transform cards, the 2-sided cards, just into those sleeves. It's totally fine. I think checklist is just like another logistical element that's kind of tedious that I'm not really about, and I don't mind flipping the cards in the sleeves.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I'll even go a little step further. So this is something that I've now run back into, especially with the advent of Innistrad. So before I commit to a card, I'll just print on a paper proxy, like if I'm testing it, right? So now I will literally just print a paper proxy where the 2 cards, the front and the back, are directly beside each other, and just fold it in half and just put it in the sleeve. So even if you're doing that, you can still just pull it out and flip it around. Sometimes it's a little bit clunky, but if you are like me and you like to double sleeve your cards, it is about the same thickness as a double sleeved card. So if I am double sleeving my cards, I just straight up run the cards, and people take them in and out of the cube just like they normally would. I think anytime that you have something external that you have to find, especially if it's like in a different box, and it's like, all right, did anyone draft Search for Azcanta? All right, anyone had draft, what's the Puppet Stitcher? All right, make sure to get those out so you can use those when you draft. I think it's just a lot of extra steps. And as a cube owner, it probably doesn't bother you, but I bet your players just want to get to playing, and that's just another step that prevents them from doing so quickly.
Yep, totally with you there. Our next question is from Danny on YouTube. Do you think a monocolor cube for each color is possible? I started thinking about colors like blue that can do control and aggro and combo and monsters, but then red seems kind of difficult to manage. Justin, your thoughts?
I definitely think that it's possible, but all of the colors have different problems that they need to address. So so red is a great example. Let's start there. What I don't really think that you have a lot of great options for enchantments. Not for enchantment cards, but enchantments seem very difficult to defeat if in a mono red cube. And there's going to be similar things, in like a mono green cube. Having a bigger creature normally means you're going to win the game if you only have access to green cards. In a mono blue cube, if you have something that has untargetable or can't be countered, that's probably going to be more difficult to overcome with the rest of the cards in the cube. So you really have to think about all of the things that a color cannot do and really be careful with those things. Because when you start to play, you're like, oh, I'll play all the best cards.
Well, a lot of times, some of the best cards are because all of the colors have trouble beating them. And if you isolate to the best cards in each of the individual colors and then take away all of the other options, you might end up with cards that are almost impossible to beat. Like I said, a red enchantment is probably going to be one of the best cards in this particular cube. Like, well, normally I would say Sulphur's Vortex, but I imagine the red cube would probably be slightly more aggressive than not.
It gets a lot worse than the mono red cube.
It gets a lot worse than mono red cube. But just any sort of enchantment that is going to provide like accruing value would probably be one of the better cards in that cube. So those type of things are really significant things that you have to concern yourself with before you go down that path. But absolutely, I think that it is definitely possible. I actually think that it's a great thought exercise to try to put together like a 360 card cube, or if you're Ryan, a Tubert for each monocolored.
Yeah, I have played a mono blue cube, a mono red cube, and a mono black cube. My friend Cass is working on a mono white Tubert. I think more so than the colors having their struggles, I think you just kind of suck it up and either say, you know, this enchantment's going to be good, or I won't feature this enchantment if I think it's an issue. If you're doing a mono red cube, you do run into a pretty serious power gap thing where if you want to include some of the best, even blue cards, you know, I comment a lot that you don't run out of good blue cards. If you're trying to do 540 cards for mono blue, you're certainly going to notice the power level disparity at some point in there. I do think that a Tubert would be the ideal thing. I think limiting the size goes a long way in making a monocolor cube compelling. And I actually think you do just kind of want to lean into those weaknesses and lean in to having the cube only do so many different things. Because your color, like by its nature, by the way, the design cards is only good at so many things. The issue I actually had drafting mono red cube is there were quote unquote supported archetypes that just couldn't race the burn deck. You just can't put in decks that are trying to set up for turn 5 that die on turn 4. So I think that you really have to kind of get everything competing on the same axis and not having just kind of fanciful ideas of doing really cool things 2 turns after you're dead. Is the big thing to pay mind to there, and trying to keep the power band more limited and just make sure everyone's kind of engaging in ways where the games actually matter. Yeah,
I like that. All right. Patrick Rogers from YouTube has a couple of questions. Has paper cubing been a little more, as paper cubing has been a little more possible, what are your pandemic playables? Cards from Ikoria forward that may just be coming to tables now? In your next question, in your personal high power settings, are the cards that you are there cards that you play that few others do that you're surprised are more popular? And in high power setting, what's an archetype you think trends exotic but is still good?
So as opposed to Storm, exotic, and not good. I got to get that beat on there.
It's true.
Yeah, so with regard to pandemic playables, it's certainly the case that a lot of players have completely lapsed or at least really decreased the number of paper cards they've acquired in the last year. So that's the sentiment being expressed is, you know, what are some cards over the last couple of years during the pandemic that maybe I should look into? I haven't been picking up cards. I would recommend a resource. I would go check out my top 10 articles from every set release. That should be my article this week, actually, on StarCityGames.com. Just going to be my top 10 picks for the most impactful cube cards from the set. And I also do a little bit of outlining the themes in the sets, which will give you a good idea of what is supported. So that's a good well for pandemic playables cards released very recently that maybe you should pick up in your cube. I think that triomes are maybe overall, if we're talking about sets including Ikoria, the most potentially impactful. Just how much mana fixing you get from those. I don't think there's anything that quite competes there, but there's a ton of very good cube staples. Even just if you stick to Ikoria, Shark Typhoon is a massive game changer. Yeah, all kinds of cards released in the last couple of years, and our set reviews here on the 540, I'd also check those out. And then as terms of cards that I like, I'm surprised aren't more popular. The one that comes to mind, I was actually really floored when the Nega Cube was on Magic Online and Llanowar Visionary was just a free agent. Like that card wasn't in the Vintage, Legacy, or Modern Cube. That card's gas. That card's like it's such a good green card. And it's also kind of innocuous enough that it can show up in a Pauper Cube. I think that's just a card, if you have kind of a good stuff slant in your cube, should just be in every cube of that nature. And then an archetype that's exotic but still good. I honestly think that when it comes to high-powered cube, a lot of stuff is defined way more by cards than decks. And I think that's actually one of Storm's weaknesses, is that you're trying to draft a deck. And you need a lot of really powerful cards, but then it also needs to be functioning the same way, where a lot of the more powerful, even vintage cube decks lately are just like, all right, I'm going to play this really good threat on rate, and then next turn I'm going to do it again. And I have like a couple cheap answers, and then you got to figure it out. So I don't really have a good example of an archetype for a high power cube that I think is maybe more obscure than it should be.
I think now this is not going to be the case for listeners here, but I always feel like that in higher powered settings, this is not exotic. In fact, this is the opposite of exotic, but it's an archetype that's basically always supported, but I think it is like constantly disrespected, is mono white aggro. Ryan has obviously talked about that a lot, especially in the Magic Online cube. And maybe it's just the people that I cube with, but I always feel like that's something that's constantly disrespected. It's attacking with white creatures and like making it things like slightly uncomfortable and difficult for your opponent. So my pandemic playables, I have a list of 3. One would be my number 1, but I think that people know about this card now because of its ubiquity and standard, and that's a Seeker's Chariot. That was like one of my favorite cards from Kaldheim. Like when we actually first started this podcast, this was right after Kaldheim came out. And that quickly, like after I continued to play with that card, that became like my favorite cube card from that set. It was Seeker's Chariot. So that's one. People know about that one. Number 2 is a card that now that I've had a chance to play with it a couple times, I'm like mega sold on, and that is Auger of Autumn. This is one for Midnight Hunt. That's like my new like absolute slam dunk. Pretty much every cube should play it possible. It's such an awesome card. I even think I undersold the amount of times that you hit Coven with that card and the power level that it provides, in addition to be able to play lands beside creatures. Ryan is also a big fan of that one, I know.
Yeah, I have already played some games where one side is just totally hopeless under the Auger, so fully co-sign. Yep,
I played 9 cards in a row off the top of my deck, not like in the same turn, but without casting any cards from my hand in a game over the weekend. So that was pretty great. Okay, my actual answer that is not a brand new card to the newest set or something that is on everyone's mind is Layla, the Blade Reforged.
Layla? I think it's Layla.
Layla, the Blade Reforged. This is a red creature from a commander set.
Yes.
And I think this card is nuts. And this is definitely one that people probably that have not been super keeping up with it will definitely miss, because it's a commander card. So this is not one that people know, but this card is super sick. So that's my pandemic playable.
That's a good list.
Yep. Thank you. All right. What do we got next?
All right. Alan Ebersole on YouTube asks, what are the most egregious cube warping or cube overpowering cards? Single cards that take over a cube or make the entire cube about playing or beating that card. You've mentioned Oko a few times in this context, but is that the worst one? And what cards are on that wavelength?
This is a great question. Is Oko the worst one? Actually, I think that it might be. I actually think that honestly it might be, but I'm going to try to be a little more, outside of the Oko box with this. I think that Opposition is an incredibly warping, massively powerful card. It's essentially cube power, in my opinion. Okay, it's not a Moxen or Black Lotus. It doesn't make mana, but it is a card that when you see it in a draft, I believe that you should take it and try to make it work. Because if you were able to do so even halfway, even remotely make it work, you're going to be advantaged over any opponent in most cases, regardless of what they're playing. I don't even have this, I don't have Opposition in my Legacy Power cube because I think it would be the best card by a mile in that cube. And I think that it is a card that appears in cubes with lower power levels because people don't respect the power level of that card. And I think it's literally through the roof. It's one of the most powerful cards that does not make mana and that you can cube with, in my personal opinion. So I will outside of Oko, which I think is Oko, it's more than just powerful. It actually it provides like a miserable play experience too. Similar to Opposition. Now I like me in Opposition. I love when I have Opposition. I don't have it in my queue, but other people have it in theirs. And if they put it in there, you're damn sure I'm going to draft it. And I see it. But those are my answers.
So the Oko issue is not necessarily just the power level. It's not just the misery it induces. It's what is miserable about Oko is the fact that the card's power is so game state agnostic. It's so cheap to get online. It's only 3 mana in green. So you often see it come down on turn 2. And it's not like it's bad on turn 3. And then it just turns all of the potential threats on your opponent's side into a 3/3 with no text box. And it has so much loyalty that it's not that hard to defend it. So you can just keep doing that. So the game's no longer about anything but Oko. It's Oko and 3/3s, and you control what's a 3/3. You also get to just make your own 3/3s. So you get to downgrade opposing threats, upgrade yours, and nothing matters but Oko. You're now playing Oko the Gathering. And other cards that are going to be on the list for cards that can be that warping kind of have to do the same thing. I do just like, when I look at other people's cube lists, I see some people just like put Soul Ring in their unpowered cube, which is like, I know that that's just not going to be on most people's radar if you spend any serious amount of time working on cube, but I see it in lists. And I don't know, I think that maybe some of that is reinforced by the fact that the card is just legal in Commander. I don't know, but the card's egregious. Like you are playing Soul Ring the Gathering when it shows out on turn 1. I think Umezawa's Jite is one that if people were not playing when that card was standard legal, and I see people talking about unbanning it in Modern as if they've ever played a good game that involved Umezawa's Jite. That one, the fact that it's colorless means it's just going to show up every time it's in the cube in every draft. Unless the power level is very high, it's going to be pretty warping. It's just not interesting. You're playing Umezawa's Jite the Gathering. A card that showed up on a lot of the digital cubes in the last year or so. I've actually been pretty miffed every time I see Sublime Epiphany in a lower powered cube. And it costs 6 mana, but it does do that same thing where it just doesn't matter what's happening in the game. I'm going to counter target spell. I can counter any spell. I'm going to return any non-land permanent to your hand, and I'm going to copy any permanent I have that's any good. And now you're losing the game.
And you draw a card.
And you draw a card. Yeah, just the more game state agnostic a game piece is, coupled with how powerful it is. If a card is both powerful and game state agnostic, it's going to ruin a high volume of games.
Noted Ryan's feelings on Sublime Epiphany. All right. On to Twitter. God of Grenades asks, he says, love the podcast. Do you have any particular nuggets of wisdom for designing very narrow cubes like a token cube, morph cube, cons cube, etc.?
Design with a heavy hand. You want just to have so much stuff in the cube supporting that theme, so the theme is presented and works. And to borrow from Mark Rosewater, if you ever listen to his Drive to Work podcast or listen to his articles, if you look into he'll talk pretty openly about issues with design in sets that he's worked on. And a note that he makes about Kamigawa block had legendary stuff as a big theme, but there weren't any legendary cards at common. And so it wasn't that resonant. And his takeaway there, the one line pitch for that, if it's not at common, it's not your theme. So if you want to make your theme something that's resonant, even if it's something that's a really narrow design, you got to beat the player's head over the head with it. Every pack should heavily represent that theme. That would be my big note there.
Okay. Yeah. I don't really know if I have any. I don't think I have any follow up on that. I think Ryan nailed it.
And next we have Twitter user at eatmabeans. Love that username.
Yeah, you also pronounced it appropriately, which I really appreciate.
What's a card or cards you feel are included in too many cubes? And on the flip side, what's a card or cards that you feel aren't in enough cubes?
All right. Easy for me for this first one. What are cards that are included in too many cubes? The Sword of X and Y. Just, you want to talk. So the problem is these cards are beloved. I would say this is the most popular non-land cycle in all of Magic. Like across, like not for cubes specifically, but just for Magic players. Like they love the Swords of X and Y. I get it. They're really powerful. They're also really miserable to play against. Because sometimes your opponent drafts a Sword of Feast and Famine and you have a black and green deck. And you're just gonna lose. Why? You showed up, you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, my friend. And I think that those cards as a group, sort of body and mind outside of that, because that's especially egregious. But those cards as a group, I see all over the place in Cube. And they are just like, I feel like they're just like game ruining cards, like most of the time they show up. I would honestly, in a random match, I would rather them have a Jite than a sword that just makes their creatures like untouchable. And I'm probably in the minority for that because Jite's outrageous. I cubed the last time. I literally lost a game to that card that I wouldn't have lost otherwise. But losing against a sword when you're playing like two of the colors that the sword has protection against is just an absolutely miserable experience. And and people, they're all over the place. They're and so many cubes. What card or cards are not included in enough cubes? This is a lot tougher to answer because I don't know if there are cubes that it's so difficult because cubes are so varied. Like there's not, I think answering that question would imply that there's like a single type of cube. And in that cube, this card isn't played. And I think because of that, I'm going to take a pass on that side of the question because I don't think an answer, and my answer would either be taken out of context, saying that I'm saying that every cube should play whatever card I say, or that cubes that don't include this card are doing something wrong. So I'm going to pass on that side, just saying that most cards that should be played in cubes are played in the cubes that their designers want them in.
Mm-hmm.
Ryan?
All right. I have a number of cards that I think are in too many cubes. I'll keep it brief, though. Okay. I've already talked about Oko. I would generally put Uro in the same category.
Yeah.
Umezawa's Jite. The big one that I want to talk about, I think that a lot of cubes play too many mana rocks. Definitely when it comes to 2-mana mana rocks. Just, it can be so night and day. The difference between having mana acceleration and the other player not having it. If you want to employ a higher mana curve, but actually have games where there's tension getting up to 4 and 5 mana, just tone down the mana acceleration. That's kind of a note I've made in a number of my articles when I do the write-ups for the Spotlight cubes. There's kind of a deflating moment when a cube looks pretty cool. And it's like, well, then it has 10 signets and or 10 talismans. Like, okay, well, we're not playing games anymore. We're playing mana ramp. And as far as cards and not enough cubes, I feel generally the same as Justin here. Your cube, your rules, the experience you're trying to cultivate. the list of cards that I'm always happy to see in a cube, and then I tend to put in all of my cubes, are largely just a lot of nuts and bolts stuff that you will find in most cubes. Like, I'm big on Thraben Inspector, I'm big on Baleful Strix, I'm big on Walking Ballista, I'm big on Preordain, I'm big on Lightning Bolt. And you just generally find most of the cards that I really like in most cubes anyway.
Okay. Yeah. I that's pretty much how I feel too. All right. Before we move on, we're going to take a quick break as soon as I figure out where we stopped. Okay, yes. All right. We're going to take a quick break. We have more bills to pay with ads, so we're going to do that and be back in just a moment. Hey, let me ask you something. Do you like value? Look, no need to answer that. 1, I can't hear you. 2, I already know that you do, okay? You're a Magic player. 1. 2, you love Cube. That's why you're listening to this podcast. Well, the only thing that's better than listening to this podcast for free is becoming a Star City Games premium member. For $7.99 a month, you get exclusive access to Magic the Gathering content from some of the best writers and creators in the entire game. And on top of that, you get 5% off of all Magic sealed product, 10% off of all Magic singles, and 15% off of all supplies. And yes, that includes sleeves, deck boxes, the works. If you love value, and I know you do, go to starcitygames.com/join-premium. Star City Games Premium, $7.99 a month. Get that value right now. All right, Ryan, continuing on. Tall and Tangy on Twitter says, for those of us who like things to be a little bit spikier, how do you suggest stakes or team drafting?
So something that my group was doing a lot of in the year before the pandemic hit were cake bets. And that would be a bet where everybody is at a gathering and there is cake available, but not everybody paid for it. So you do a bet where the losing team has to buy cake for everybody. That's a good one, like prop bets like that. I don't remember. I think Cedric and Patrick used to do prop bets. They'd be towel bets where you'd make a bet and then the loser had to buy the towel bearing some logo for the other person. One rule that I like if you're going to do stakes drafting, whatever the stakes are, is that if a player on the losing team wins all their matches, the rest of the team covers the bill. Mm-hmm. You don't have to pay if you go undefeated. I think that's a really good rule.
Yep, I agree with that. Sure. So, first of all, I love the team draft. So 3v3 is 3v3 team draft. First to 5 match wins is that is a classic part of my cubing experience and history. I will say that now I don't want anyone listening that might work at the same place that I work to take this out of context. But there was a time before I worked at Star City Games where we would like to play for pride points at events. And I would say playing for pride points or an equivalent in something else makes it, especially in a team draft, significantly more interesting. I actually don't care as much when you're doing an 8-player draft, but when you have teammates and people you can talk shit to, especially when you might be taking their pride points later when you beat them, and you can take their pride points out of their theoretical hands, that feels really good. And as long as everyone's on board, I would say that I highly suggest playing for a small amount of pride points just to juice the spiky nature of the draft, which I personally like to do.
Yeah. We don't really do that so much anymore. Pride is a sin and all, but
yeah,
it was a fun thing to do as a younger man.
I haven't done it in a while. I like your cake bet significantly more because as you've gotten older, pride is easier to come by, but cake takes effort in some sort of fashion. And yes, really what you want out of the person that you're beating is for them to have to exert effort. Oh, so yeah. I really like that much better. So I'm going to go with Ryan's.
All right, next we have a question from @Cryonosity. My question is, what is your Golgari gold card hot take?
What about a Golgari section hot take? There are many more interesting Golgari cards than destroy a thing. Okay, I understand. Look, everyone loves a Mouse Impulse and an Assassin's Trophy and an Abrupt Decay. Look, that's great. Here's my hot take. If you were to take 100% of the Golgari cards that said destroy blah de blah permanent out of your cube, no one would ever notice. That's my hot take.
I think that we're very much on the same page here. I was going to say, when I was thinking about this question, gold cards that are just the exact same thing as monocolor cards are not exciting. Maelstrom Pulse is just Oblivion Ring. You got to give me more.
Yep. Pretty simple there. All right. At M2D Lizo on Twitter. Do you have, or do you prefer a smaller cube where you see all of the cards and their archetypes, or a larger cube where it's a mixed bag? And possibly related, is there a draft person count that you favor? Ryan, I know you have no opinions on this at all, so we'll just skip this question. I'm just kidding.
This is going to be one where you're going to hear Justin and I diverge, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
I like cubes where you try to draft all the cards. I think as a designer, you have a lot of control over the environment. I really like cubes that have moving parts and overlapping archetypes. I don't so much like the a bunch of archetypes and hoping to get the right parts in the draft that you're doing and just settling when they don't show up. Which is, kind of a negative framing, but it's my opinion. It's my show, damn it.
It is.
I like 8-person drafts with 360 card cubes. And when it comes to Tuberts, I'm actually pretty big for the 180 card cubes. I like the 4-person draft where you draft all 180 cards. And I also really like the 2-player drafts. But I will say the delta between how much I enjoyed other cubes with 2 players and Tuberts with 2 players, that's smaller than the delta between 4-player drafts with bigger cubes and Tuberts. Like the appreciation that I have for 4-player drafts is much higher than it used to be since I started drafting 180 card cubes. Yeah,
I imagine that's probably the case for that. So I'll go backwards. Is there a draft person count I favor? I like I said in a couple of questions ago, I love a 6-person 3v3 team draft. Like I just absolutely love it. And conveniently, if you have a 540 card cube, which is my preferred size of cube, you can do 2 of those back to back. Now, I don't like to do that because I like to shuffle it up because I don't like the second time you draft to know what is or isn't available. Because then that would be what Ryan wants, which is a 360 card cube, so you know exactly what's available. I just like too many Magic cards, and I don't think it's fair for me to have to narrow it down to 360. That's not fair to me, so I'm not going to do that to myself. I just like too many, so I'm just going to add more of them. In reality, I really like the varied play experience that a card or that a cube that is larger than 360 can offer. I don't love huge cubes. I think the largest I would want is around 540, which is what my primary cube is. And that's just because I like to see a bunch of different cards and I like to play with a bunch of different cards. I do think that it takes more work because if you don't pay attention to it, the bottom cards will lag and just continually not be picked. But as long as you're like going through and trying to iterate constantly, then that's where I like to spend my time playing cube if I were to pick. That doesn't mean that I don't like a 360. I absolutely do. But for me personally, owning a cube, 540 is my number.
Right, next question is, I'm going to go with @Cowcoon on Twitter. What are your favorite 1-card archetypes? Cards like Golos and Birthing Pod, which when added to a cube, spawn an entire draft archetype by themselves.
It's pretty close to one of those. I've loved Field of the Dead since it's existed. Because I already love drafting lands. Before Field of the Dead existed, I wouldn't spend any thought on my first my first pack of 15 cards just drafting 5 non-basic lands. Like that's just something I do on a regular basis. So now when I get to do that, to draft all these non-basics, then also just draft a Field of the Dead so I can kill you with the non-basics, that's my go-to. It's a card that I pass as that card has existed for the last couple of years, that I find myself passing less and less frequently. So, and that is absolutely a one card archetype, because that is the one card that you need for it to go. And I know people have varying feelings about Field of the Dead, probably based on other formats that aren't cube, but that is my one favorite that's a single card archetype.
I tend to be colder on one card archetypes than a lot of cube designers. The card that I will say that I had in the Magic Online Grixis cube, I think started to gain some traction after I put it there, is Amanitau's Augury, which does ask your deck to do some other things. It's an 8-mana sorcery, and you exile your top 7 cards, and you can cast a spell of every different card type and play a land from among them. And it's kind of a bridge card between Reanimator or like Cheaty Emrakul decks and Storm, because you're either casting a Boom Boom for free or a bunch of spells once you get through that 8 mana. And that's a card that I will pick really highly and just build my deck largely around resolving it. You kind of have to like try to do something else, but when it comes to one card, when I draft it, my whole plan is to put that card in the stack. Amanitau's Augury is my pick.
Okay, I like that. It's actually a solid one. All right. Quest Steel on Twitter asks, do you have a pet card that you almost always draft over higher powered level cards despite not being the correct choice?
For me, the answer is probably Sulfuric Vortex. I have put up a lot of 2/1s playing mono red when I mull to 5 or whatever, or just my opponent does anything remotely powerful playing Vintage Cube, but I keep coming back. I don't think that mono red is generally as good as mono white in the Magic Online Vintage Cube, but I have a tough time saying no to Sulfuric Vortex.
Yeah, mine is, and this is not a like a powerhouse card by any means, but I think that I value this card higher than like any other person I know. That's Looter Ilkor, and now Suspicious Stowaway. I constantly like feel like I look at packs and I'm like, I think this is just the best card in the pack, and I know that it's probably not. And I end up with that card a much higher percentage of the time whenever I see it in whatever cube that it's in. So I'm gonna go Looter Ilkor, even though it's probably not the correct choice. But man, it's sure won me a lot of games.
Love that card.
Yeah.
Our next question is from @FlorenceLorraine on Twitter. How would you recommend introducing others to Cube as a format, especially if you yourself are newish?
That's a very good question. So I think that Cube can be difficult. So there's two different kinds of new. There's new to Magic and there's new to Cube. New to Magic is tough because there's a lot of rules to know in Magic. And Cube is actually like going through the history of the game and like introducing like all of these rules at once, because there's all of these keywords and things can be very confusing. So I would say that, I can't believe I'm going to say this, I would say that normal booster draft in a single like drafting environment is going to be better for a new player before you move them on to Cube, because it's more difficult to get a grasp on everything if you're still learning about what makes Magic tick. I think once you have that, you're like, I've played Magic, I know how to play Magic, but I've never cubed before. I think that's a little bit different. I actually really like lower powered cubes where a lot of the cards are very samey and people can kind of draft cards that they like and not have to worry about a card being specifically worse than another card. I think those type of cubes are really good at getting new players to understand why Cube is fun. Because when I'm introducing someone to Cube, I'm trying to get them to feel like the Cube is the best Magic experience that they've had. And once you're hooked, you will go on your Cube journey independently and find different cubes that you like to draft, especially in the advent of the digital age. And maybe if you're a Cube designer, you'll start to maybe put it together, more carefully. or more specifically to how you want to do it in the future. But anything that is like a lower power level, more uncommons, maybe not necessarily rarity restricted, especially if you listen to our like pauper and peasant episode. Those cubes have their own kind of identities that are somewhat different than a non-rarity restricted cube. So that's kind of where I would land. It's really difficult as a new cube owner to say what kind of cube, because it's like, now I'm asking you to put a whole cube together for yourself. But in reality, that is what I want. I want you to, whoever's listening to this, I do want you to put a cube together. So that's where I'll stick.
Yeah, I like, meet the player where they're at, the kind of play experience they're used to, or they're interested in, but make it cube. And the nature of the question here, saying that you yourself are new-ish to cube draft, I think a good way to get somebody involved, just make it a collaboration. Collaborate with them. Say, I'm interested in getting into cube. I don't know if you are. I'm thinking about trying to build this kind of environment. Maybe these are the notes that you have. You have some cards you want to feature, some archetypes you're looking at designing, and work together on building the cube, because that's a really good way to get somebody invested in playing it.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Ryan. Okay. This is a good one. At ImpSeal on Twitter asks, why is it called a cube? If you can rename the concept, what would it be?
So to answer the first part of the question, I tried to Google this. I think that the official answer, as far as I could discover, has been lost to time. Maybe you know better than I do. I came up with some acceptable answers, but not one that could be verifiably the reason. If I could rename it, what would it be? Cube really works. It had to be something that really popped like that. Obviously, I've been calling 180 card cubes tuberts, but that's just kind of a brain-wormy, meme riff from calling cubes cuberts, cubing with two tuberts. So really, I'm pretty attached to the name cube, even if I have no idea where it came from.
So I was always under the impression that it was based on just the box of cards that the assortment of like singleton cards was in.
Yeah, and I have seen that listed as like an acceptable answer. And then also a cube, you have the four corners on both sides. You have 8 players. But when I tried to trace it back, I think I found a Blogatog answer that said, no one knows.
Oh, maybe. Yeah. That's what I've always thought. But to be fair, I did not dig. I just thought that's what I had heard. So that was what I was going to stick with. So, yeah, that is what I got. I don't know what I would rename it. I'd leave it up to Ryan for renaming.
All right, then. Riot Anuki on Twitter asked, top 5 unconventional cards for cube. Cards like Conspiracies, Silver Border, the Mystery Booster playtest cards, or misprints.
Oof. Okay. Yes. I'm going to hit you with a little bit of each. I'm going to skip Conspiracies because I think that's kind of a different play experience. But I will go with a card that is from Conspiracy. Is it from Conspiracy?
Is it Cogwork Librarian?
It is Cogwork Librarian. Yeah,
Hell yeah.
It's from Conspiracy, right?
Yep.
The original Conspiracy. Yeah. Cogwork Librarian. Absolutely love that card. I think it is the best like draft affecting card of all of those. I absolutely love it. I think it's fantastic. So Cogwork Librarian. Silver Border cards, Booster Tutor. Easy pick. Absolutely love that card. Creates all sorts of fun moments in the draft. There's not many things that are better than saying, all right, I'm in a terrible position. I'm going to lose the game. I have to Booster Tutor, and I have to get a really specific kind of card to win, and then hitting it, and then winning the game from there. Which is awesome. Misprints. Yes. Moloku. Spanish Moloku. Makes 2/2 tokens. Moloku's not very good, but Moloku that makes 2/2 tokens is very good. So if you have one of those that is significantly more cubable than Moloku is, which I don't believe has been traditionally cubable in quite some time. Mystery Booster playtest cards. My favorite is Lightning Colt. which is just a 3/3 for 5 that's an instant creature. And when it enters the battlefield, it deals 3 to anything. So it's like a lightning bolt, but it's a creature that's also an instant. So if you have a spells matters, it's still an instant. So if you have like a young pyromancer out and you play lightning cult, you still get a 3/3, but you also get an elemental. But
yeah, for me, I think Cogwork Librarian, definitely with you on that one. I'm generally happy with any mystery booster test cards. I think Unicycle is one of my favorite ones to read. I largely avoid silver border and particularly wonky things, but I cannot resist the allure of Cogwork Librarian.
Yeah, who can? It's great. It just makes the draft so fun. That's what I just love about it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Viking4 on Twitter asks, what kind of cards would you want to help you make your least favorite color pair in Cube, e.g. Selesnya, more interesting and fun? Quotes around that. What directions would you want to take?
So when it comes to building the gold section, there's a couple things you want. You maybe are going into a second color to shore up the weakness of the other color. Maybe the two colors just play very well together, so you want something efficient. Or maybe you're just going to an archetype defining card, some flagship for some style of deck. Selesnya just is really tough to combine, just because green and white are just generally up to very different things. Green's up to mana ramp in a lot of cubes. Mono white is kind of facilitating either control decks or aggressive decks. And in the kind of high power cubes, you'll see a lot of colorless mana acceleration. So it's not really a compelling reason to mix green and white. I'd be looking for something that is ideally cheap. I don't think for Selesnya I'm looking for an archetype defining card, because I'm not trying to draft green-white usually without at least a third color. So I think
but that's because of the initial problem.
Yes, yeah, I want to see more stuff from green and white independently. A draw to Selesnya, I really just need something cheap that's really good on rate, and Watchwolf isn't going to do it. Selesnya card that stands out as far as performing, I actually really like, specifically in the context of Tempo Tubert, which is a really efficient cube. A lot of cards trading 1 for 1, a lot of stuff happening at instant speed. Voice of Resurgence is actually a really nice one. The best thing it does, though, is it costs 2 mana. So every time I see a Selesnya card and it costs 4 mana, I'm not in the market for that. It's not going to fix the problem. So my most important thing, it would be a 2 mana card, or in the right set, a 1 mana green-white hybrid card. I think that's what it needs to be.
All right, well, we'll talk about Selesnya more because it is my least favorite color pair, just like it is also Ryan's. And a big reason for, well, those are my least 2 favorite colors in Magic, and they have been for over 20 years. But they've not helped themselves because, for whatever reason, and like, okay, so right now we're in the middle of Crimson Vow preview season, right? And the same thing is happening as happens in every single set that is supporting, like, specifically supporting green and white as a 2-color pair. Pick a fucking lane. Are you doing +1/+1 counters? Are you doing tokens? What are you doing? Why are you doing both of these things? Why is every other color combination gets to do one thing? Selesnya is like, well, what about 2 things? And we'll do each of them half as good as we should. And this is the case. This has been the case for literally all of history. So you never end up with cards. You never end up with like a critical mass of cards to have a Selesnya section that is engaging enough for you to want to do it. I've tried like everything. It's like, it drives me crazy that I like can't figure out Selesnya, and I blame myself, but who I should be really blaming is Wizards of the Coast, because they're making the cards. It's not like it's just my problem. It's everyone, which is why Viking on Twitter asked this question. There's another person later in the show that's going to ask about Selesnya because it sucks as a 2-color combination. And you really, really have to specifically like it and really like doing a thing that everything else can do better. Mono white can do better. Mono green can do better. Other colors independently can often do better. Where Selesnya doesn't even have a thing that it can do better than anything else. And that is insane to me as a color combination. So I don't know. What do you? I legitimately, honestly, it's like driving me crazy. I don't know. I wish they would just pick a thing and then do that thing. I don't even care what it is at this point. Literally just pick a fucking strategy that you want to support with Selesnya and then do that for like 3 sets in a row. Just do that. Just do that thing. Or even one full set instead of half of a set. All right, what's the next question?
Lee McLeo asks, can you all talk about shuffling / making packs? Any thoughts on seeding packs?
Okay, so seeding packs, I'll start with that. I feel 2 different ways about seeding packs. I think in traditional cubes, like you got 360 cards, 540 cards, what have you, and it's just a normal cube. I'm very, 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 very against seeding packs. I think that if you are adequately shuffling, that is largely not necessary. However, I think if you have specialty type cubes, I know specifically that this person asking has an artifact cube. I think seeding packs in certain ways makes more sense because you are trying to provide a certain experience. And sometimes that is what you need to do to provide that experience. And I don't think that seeding packs in those cases is taking away from the experience. It is adding to it. But if you seed packs in more traditional cubes, what you're going to likely do is just homogenize the experience for your drafters. So that's something that I'm very wary of in traditional cubes, but feel pretty different when you get to non-traditional cubes. Shuffling, making packs. So what I do, and I think we've talked about this on the show before, but to go in full depth, I like to face up, put the cards into 8 stacks until I have gone through all of the cards. 1, this allows me to look at all of the cards, which I really love because I love Magic cards. I like to look at them. 2, it allows me to count the cards at the same time. So I know if I am missing a card, if I land on a certain spot when I'm finished doing the entire queue. Then when I have that, I have those 8. I will split those into different sections and then briefly shuffle those. And then, as we have said previously, it is actually more important to switch the cards you are shuffling than to shuffle the cards you're shuffling for longer. So with 8, you can kind of do it to where you pick 2, shuffle for like 5 seconds, pick another 2, shuffle for 5 seconds, and keep doing that. And ultimately, this process takes like under 10 minutes to randomize the entire cube. Now, it's probably going to take people that have not done this longer, but once you get into the habit of doing this, it takes a very short amount of time. And this is like fully randomized because really what you want to avoid is your drafter saying, oh, looks like this was someone's deck from the last draft, which is my least favorite thing. And I will make eyes at them whenever I hear that, because sometimes, listen, Tony, sometimes the cards just are together in a pack. Okay. That's just how Magic works. Okay. Sometimes they're just together in the same pack. Okay. I shuffled it. Anyway, that's how I feel about those 2 things.
Yeah, I have no additional thoughts outside of the fact that I will never, and I hope I never have to pile shuffle an entire cube.
I just like doing it. I don't think that part's necessary. I just enjoy doing that part. All right. We have Katzamandius from Twitter asks, for cubes with themes, i.e. Ryan's Spooky Cube, or I'm making a cube to celebrate women in Magic, how much should you sacrifice play experience for flavor / theme? And they go on to say, I know that I've definitely lost some play experience equity in my cube for the sake of getting cards that fit better with the theme. I've not tested the cube yet, but I'm concerned I sacrificed too much. So some thoughts on that topic as a whole would be interesting.
Yeah, so this is actually a pretty interesting question. That cube of that nature, celebrating women in Magic, is very different than Spooky Cube in terms of design parameters. There's a version of Spooky Cube, if all you know is the title, which maybe is just, ooh, this art is very spooky. There's a lot of cards from the Dark and Legends that are really evocative, really kind of spooky, dark imagery, maybe a lot more focused on the art, whereas my focus is actually really heavily mechanically, where it's called the Spooky Cube, but then it draws a lot from the design and the play experience of playing Innistrad. And then there's actually a lot of influence from Odyssey Block, which has a lot in common with Innistrad, discarding graveyard matters kinds of stuff. So it's actually really heavily mechanically driven, even though it has kind of an aesthetic skinning to it. And there's a lot of creative ways you could tackle designing a cube about women in Magic and that sort of thing, where it can be maybe the characters are women. Captain Sisay would actually be a good Celestia card to have in this cube. It would be thematic, and you could probably pretty easily make it kind of powerful. And you can do a lot of different things. I think that if you are designing a play experience, I don't like sacrificing the gameplay, but there are a lot of really creative workarounds. It doesn't have to be imagery just of women. You could have women artists. That could be the original card art. You can even commission local artists to contribute in that way. Even just your local play group, just to have some of your friends or people in your community sign the cards, modify the cards. A lot of really creative ways to tackle that. I think if you want it to exist as a cube that you play, then I would try to put the gameplay pretty close to the center of the decisions that you're making, because there's a lot of other ways to make something that is nice to look at and evocative that doesn't involve getting a bunch of cards together in a box.
Yeah, I think that I agree with Ryan that ultimately at the end of the day, if you want something that that your play group is going to want to come back to and play, you do have to be really careful on sacrificing too much of that. But I think Ryan outlined a lot of excellent options for you to still accomplish what you're wanting to do and not have to sacrifice too much on the play side. And I would imagine that if you're asking this question, you probably have a pretty good handle on where that is. Because if you're saying I'm worried that I've sacrificed too much, then you are probably more aware than you think you are of where your cube is in regards to playability versus enforcement of theme. And your enforcement of theme is a lot more open to interpretation, which I think is going to be a positive for you, because you have a lot of different options, especially in cases of, cards that have different arts and such, or different artists. And you can get that and that support to make a cube that celebrates women in a different way than having to really force certain things into your cube, which is, I think, like I said, something you probably already know.
Next question is from @Curtis88. What are cards or archetypes that you think are bad, not fun, or you just straight up don't like, but feel obligated to include in your cubes?
None. I don't feel obligated to include anything that I feel fits on that wavelength in my cubes.
Yeah.
I'm being perfectly honest. Like, if something is like, this just isn't fun, I'm just gonna take it out. Like, I don't care if people think that it should be in there. I don't care if it's a card that people enjoy. I've taken cards out of my cube that I like that I'm like, this is not fun. It's just not fun for people. So I just don't do that. Mm-hmm. I will say that my answer for other people's cubes of cards that I like to play against the least are the Eldrazi Titans. I think that those are pretty miserable play experience, both from drafting and playing, because they're like really, really specific in the way that you have access to them in a deck building scenario. And then in a gameplay scenario, they're pretty miserable most of the time. I won't say 100% of the time, but I would say that the amount of times that I have had an engaging game, regardless of the side that I've been on, is pretty small. And I think a lot of people feel like they're obligated to include those in their cubes. I don't like them. I've never had them in my cubes. And I'm talking about the ones with Annihilator specifically. Mm-hmm. So So none for me. I've emboldened myself over more than a decade of cube design. I don't play that. I don't play those games anymore.
Yeah, once again, your cube, your rules. An archetype that I eschewed from the Magic Online Grixis cube that I'm sure a lot of people wanted in it was Splinter Twin. Don't like drafting it. I don't like playing with it. I don't like playing against it. I don't like seeing it in packs. At a certain power level, I do have it in the Grixis Tubert. That's because I'm trying to really force a combo experience. The one archetype that I think it's featured a lot that I have in some of my cubes that I actually don't really like, but I feel like just the nature of cards printed pushes you there. I'm not a big fan of Reanimator as an archetype. It's very powerful. The ways that you interact with it are like a little tough. I don't think that a lot of the games are very satisfying, and the decks tend to be either busted or non-functional. So I think that my feelings about Reanimator are kind of similar to how you feel about the Eldrazi Titans. I do still feature it because when I think of the most powerful black cards, it's like difficult for Entomb and Reanimate to not make the list, even though the gameplay is not the most compelling to me. But I do like controlling Gristlebrand. It's not all bad for me, but it's pretty variable how I feel about Reanimator from one day to another.
Yeah. Well, I want to apologize to Ryan Sachs. I know we just lost you as a listener due to Ryan Overturf's comments about Splinter Twin, but we had a good run, 36 episodes. All right. Thomas Gunn Music on Twitter asks, what are some of your favorite cube inclusions if a cube contains companions? Bonus question. Which companions do you like to cube with the most? Is there a cube environment where you would consider playing them without their 3-mana attacks?
So the two that I like the most are Lurrus of the Dream Den and Yorion, whatever Yorion's superlative is.
The Sky Noodle.
Yeah, that's about it.
Mm-hmm.
The Lurrus ones are some pretty easy ones. They tend to be what you see in Constructed, Mishra's Bauble, Seal of Fire, Deadweight. And if I'm going to put both these cards in a cube, which I have done, I'm pretty sure I've done that before. Anyway, cards that work with both are kind of nice. I like the Omens. Not surprising. It's pretty common when I work with a card in cube that I tend to pull a lot of stuff from Constructed Magic of that era because that's what it was designed to do. So Omen of the Sea is a nice one that plays with Lurrus and or Yorion. As to playing them without the 3-mana attacks, I think we ended up doing one draft just because they had been nerfed before we got to play with Lurrus. And I don't like it when cube functions differently than the rest of Magic, with rare exceptions. So I'm not really about that. And they're already just so powerful, even with the 3-mana attacks, that you can do it in your Vintage cube. But the reality of the format is like Lurrus is not legal in Vintage. So you're not really being true to anything. That's just the decision to push something that everybody knows is already very powerful.
I actually agree with every single word that Ryan just said, down to the companions that he named. Those are the two that I have in my cube that are that I think are good on their own or in the companion role and are fun in both cases with the 3-mana attacks. And I think that's a hell of an errata, and there's a reason that it happened. I'll just put it that way.
All right, so this question is actually fairly similar to something we've discussed before. At NatCRNN asks, thoughts on the inclusion of cards that are pauper legal online but not available in paper, EX Swords of Plowshares, which is downshifted in Jumpstart Historic Horizons. So kind of citing a reason that you could put Swords of Plowshares in a pauper cube, even though it's not physically a common. Any additional thoughts that this example might bring to mind, Justin?
Yeah, I'll just reiterate, something we said at the top of the show I think that you absolutely should include cards that you feel are an appropriate power level, regardless of their rarity. And if you're still wanting to constrain yourself on rarity, which I think is still great, absolutely pay attention to other formats where they have been printed at such rarity. I will go on further to say that please be careful, as you might be adding cards that are significantly more powerful. And there's a reason they were printed at higher rarities in most other cases. So Swords of Plowshares is a hell of a card. And I would say that it is going to become your best removal spell in your entire cube if you add it to a pauper cube. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Swords is not like an egregious magic card. Man, it's quite powerful, and it will be better than every other removal spell that you have. I don't know the rest of the cards in your cube from a removal standpoint, but I bet it will be better than everything but Baby Lightning Bolt. So just be mindful of what you're doing.
Yep. Once again, your cube, your rules. If it ends up warping the play experience in a negative way, I would change the rules.
There you go. All right, let's do one more before we take our last break. We have a Crassa... Man. Should have made Ryan say this one. Krasomatamotsky. That's not right. Anyway, you know who you are. On Twitter, you asked, what cards make a cube powerful and how do you identify them? Oko/Skullclamp is always a 10. Returnal Witness, Young Pyromancer feel much more context dependent. Channel is weaker if all you can ramp out is a rocks. Is this just synergy versus bombs?
Yeah, so much like approaching various constructed formats, this is more pronounced in the formats that rotate. Standard is where I would look here, but context is what makes cards powerful and increases the power level of cube. That example of channel, let's say you have channel in a cube where everything is like double or triple pipped and there's no colorless cards. Yeah, that's pretty weak. Channeling out Kozilek and Emrakul and Ulamog, that's a lot more powerful. So the context it shows up in, that's going to increase the power level of the cube. It tends to be the presence of both individually powerful cards, but then also synergies that really brings up the entire environment. And certainly there are cards that are a bit more context driven, but what tends to put them over is the presence of other very powerful cards. Young Pyromancer is actually a really great card to highlight this. That card is Goblin Piker. And if you're spending a lot of mana, for instance, in sorceries, the upside is pretty marginable. You would put it in the decks, you would put Goblin Piker in. It would perform better, but you would be asking the question, okay, all my spells are divinations. Would I play Goblin Piker in this deck? It's not different enough for that question to have a different answer. But when you bring up the power level of spells, you go to 1 mana, really impactful stuff. Like I really want to play with Ponder, Preordain, Taxian Probe, Lightning Bolt. Then Young Pyromancer is like, oh, this card's really good because it plays really well with my other cards. So it is kind of both things.
I will also use Young Pyromancer as my example, but I'm going to go in a different direction. I think Young Pyromancer is an excellent card. It's one of my actually favorite cards to just cube with because I just like that type of gameplay. I like doing a thing that I normally would do and then getting some sort of value out of it. I love Tireless Tracker. I love Young Pyromancer. Stuff like that. There are times that I've drafted like a red-green deck where I have 4 instants and sorceries in the deck. Young Pyromancer is an incredible card, and it's a Goblin Piker in that deck, and it's not providing anything else. It doesn't mean that card is not powerful. I actually think that Skullclamp fits into the same category, but it's obviously more powerful when it's good. But I've also played a deck where I just have like 3 creatures in the deck, and I don't really have anything that makes tokens. It might be a control deck.
I did let that one lie, but Skullclamp is not remotely in the category of Oko.
Yeah. So the reason for Oko and other cards that might be in that camp that are what we'll call a 10 is something that Ryan alluded to earlier on the podcast, and that's it doesn't matter the game that you're playing or the deck that you're playing it in. Whenever this card hits the table, it is immediately impactful in any way that of the context that the game is going. And those cards are pretty rare, but that is a bomb beyond bomb. Because a bomb oftentimes in a cube setting is something that fits your strategy incredibly well. Let's say that I have drafted 11 non-basic lands, and then in pack 3 I opened Field of the Dead. That's a bomb. But I can also open Field of the Dead, and I've drafted 2 non-basic lands. It's that becomes, now it's you're talking about, well, is this context dependent? Is it synergy? Well, it could be a bomb for your deck, or it could be, well, I really would love to play this card, but I can't because of the choices that I made prior in the draft. So context is absolutely king, and there's so few cards like Oco that I would even remove Skull Clamp from that category and put it down with the young Pyromancers of the world, even though, again, at its best, it's certainly more powerful than Pyromancer. But you really have to work hard, or, well, yeah, I guess you probably have to work hard to find cards that are like Oco that are just going to be just A pluses in 100% of the games that they're played in.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we are going to take our last break. We've been going for longer than I thought, but we're not done. We still have some more questions, so we'll be back in just one moment.
Hello there from Dominario's Judgment, a weekly podcast for Star City Games with me, Dom Harvey.
And me, Ari Lex.
Where we bring you the latest, greatest, and downright weirdest things Modern has to offer.
Want to know what to expect for next weekend's events? We've got you covered.
Do you want deep breakdowns of the hot topics and decks in Modern? We've got you covered.
Just want to make sure you don't miss the latest nonsense before your opponents teach you a lesson about it in the queues? Oh yeah, we have definitely got you covered. Find us every week on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Or if you want to head over to StarCityGames.com, we'll be right there alongside all the great content from all your other favorite content producers.
All right, we're back to wrap up. We actually have quite a few more questions, but we're back anyway on our mailbag episode. Next question is from GHPAR4 on Twitter. What are your picks for the worst cards to be in the Magic Online cubes? Non-cube Spotlight. My current frontrunner is Whipcorder.
Oh, baby. Let me tell you. The very first Magic Online cube, one, it was not good. But in that not goodness, there's a card that I've never seen anyone put in a cube in my entire life that was in that cube, and I've never forgotten. I've never forgotten about this card. And to this day, I've never seen another cube with this card in it. This card is Rite of Ruin from Avacyn Restored. Ryan, do you have any idea what this card does?
I am trying, but I can't.
You shouldn't.
I don't have
you
it.
shouldn't.
I don't have it.
Okay, I'm going to read you the text. Rite of Ruin, 5 red sorcery. Choose an order for artifacts, creatures, and lands. Each player sacrifices 1 permanent of the first type, sacrifices 2 permanents of the second type, then sacrifices 3 of the third type. This was in the original Magic Online cube.
Mercy.
This card is terrible. It literally has. I've never seen anyone cast this or play this in any format, cube included or not. It's irrelevant. Cards. I don't know. I don't understand this card. I don't understand the existence of this card. It was in the cube. As soon as I read this question, this was the only thing I could think of. So, Rite of Ruin. It was in there. Trust me.
All right, first, I'm going to say that this question is unfair to Whipcorder. That you would play that card sometimes if it was in the cube today. Okay.
Yeah.
Creature with power and toughness, on rate, whatever. A little hard to cast. Who cares? My answer. We talked about this card previously on the podcast, but Grim Backwoods was in the Magic Online Vintage cube for a time, and that card is just not close. Makes your mana worse for an undesirable color pair on a land.
Yes. Yeah. It's like. All right. Crinosity on Twitter asked, how has the Modern Horizons 2 artifacts played out in your cubes?
Yeah, so I imagine you're going to have some insights on this one. I also have played with these. I think that a lot of this question is going to deal with the additional modular creatures printed in red and or white in Modern Horizons 2. And there's some other really nice ones. Thought Monitor is awesome. These cards have been really significant contributions to my my artifact Tubert. I've really loved the way they've all played. Some more cheap cards, more cards with affinity. If you want to count Urza's Saga in this camp, I think that I would just basically put that card in only powered cubes. That card is nonsensically powerful. In general, though, the nuts and bolts stuff I like quite a lot.
I have added a red and white artifact aggro theme to my primary 540 card cube. When people have drafted it, it has done extremely well. I would actually say that it might actually have the highest win percentage of any deck that's been drafted. However, I'm having a problem that when people don't respect it, they just don't draft the cards at all. But it's weird, so I think it's just going to take some time. But I have seen it enough times, and I don't think it has literally ever had in fact, literally had a draft over the weekend, a 3v3, where both of my teammates were in red, and one person was in like Jeskai artifacts, and then one person was in red and white, and both went 2-1, cutting each other off in a team draft. Playing this. I would say they've played out very well. People don't respect them enough, so that's the main problem. But they have been very good, and I'm excited to continue to add to that archetype as we get more tools, hopefully in the next year.
I'm not going to try to pronounce this as a word. This comes from Twitter user at BRCIEN. What are the cards? Exactly. Brian with a C. What are the cards in the cube for the cool more than the power?
Grafted War Gear. I love that card.
It is very cool.
It is a very cool card. It has not been good in quite some time. But man, I love me a Grafted War Gear. The thing is, like, I know that it's not powerful enough, and I've cut it from cubes because of that, but I try it every time, and I'm like, nah, this isn't good enough. But I keep trying it, and I keep wanting it to be good, and it's just not. It's just not enough. But man, it's such a cool card. +3/+2, and you could equip it for 0, and all that you have to do to re-equip it is have your creature die. It's not so bad, right?
I think if you want to answer this question about any physical cube, look for the card with the most shuffleware.
Yeah,
that card is in the cube because it's been played a lot, because the person really loves it.
That's true. Do you have any particular card that comes to mind?
I mean, this is once again going to be Tombstone Stairwell.
Okay.
And then the card in the Grixis Tubert. I have played with the Candelabra of Thanos in that cube, and to some decent effect. There's High Tide and Clarion Academy. But if I did not own one, I wouldn't go out of my way to get one.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. All right. Geez. Okay, I'm going to give this one a shot. At Grigulinator on Twitter asks, what offbeat or less ubiquitous theme are you most proud of being able to make work in one of your cubes? Love the show. It's finally what pushed me to build my very first cube.
Hell yeah, love that. Mine is going to be Madness in Spooky Cube. I love drafting the blue-red or Grixis Madness. I guess the deck is sometimes blue-black and sometimes red-black too. We did a candlelit Spooky Cube draft on Halloween. My first 3 picks in order were Wonder, Anger, Careful Study.
Oh my god.
That's just so cool.
Yeah, that's good.
I love that.
Oh, that's good. I, for a probably a solid like 2 years, had both mono blue and mono black Devotion in my cube. This was like right off of the heels of Return to Ravnica and Theros, and they were highly played and drafted archetypes. The only problem was they're pretty parasitic, and they're not new card friendly, and that's ultimately what pushed them out. But they did work. They did work, and it was very fun to play with a lot of those cards. So it's good when you can have a cube where you're like, oh man, Night Veil Spectre can fit in both of these archetypes, and that was a lot of fun.
Right, next from Nixty Bird. Couple questions from Nixty. What's the definitive list of green and white cards that don't suck shit? The first question. I'm going to say that this is specifically green and white, the Selesnya cards.
Yes. I would like to just, I'll give you my list. Tristani Discordant.
Okay, I'll add Kitchen Finks.
That's a cheat.
It's not,
but they need it.
It's green and it's white.
It's green and it's white.
Right. Next question. I've heard players say stuff like 3 CMC red creatures in a really crowded space. I have no clue if that's true, but what spaces of your cubes or cubes in general do you feel are crowded or sparse?
All right. So I really like how this question is phrased, because I've heard people say like this is crowded. I'm going to say in a blanket statement that it's not generally true. I think that's a phrase that people say a lot. And crowded is kind of just a state of mind that just means you need to kind of approach your cube and have a better understanding of what it is, rather than feeling like you're forced to play certain cards. That kind of goes back to our comments a little bit earlier in the show. As far as what is sparse, I really wish that there were more playable 1-drop blue creatures. Because I don't know if there are any. And look, I like a little Enclave Cryptologist every once in a while, but I mean like a blue creature that I don't feel not embarrassed to play, but it's like, you know what, this is going to be good in the immediate future, not like in 4 turns.
And when I read about the Magic Online cubes, I usually have the obligatory section stating all of the 1-mana blue creatures are unplayable.
Yeah.
I will say, if you feel like a space is crowded in your cube, or you're looking at someone else's cube list and you want to say a space is crowded, that is a issue with the design of the cube, not necessarily the design of Magic, as Justin pointed out. And that means that there's just too much stuff at that spot in the mana curve. There's more than people would realistically play in decks that are desirable to play, or successful decks. Tends to be spots higher on the mana curve. Not uncommon to look at a cube and think there's way too many 4-drops. Nobody's going to be happy to be playing this many 4-drops. So that kind of thing is where I would refer to space as crowded, and that's an element of a literal cube design, not of Magic design.
Yep.
And sparse, I mean, your question, we're looking for green and white cards that don't suck shit. Yeah, that's a sparse space. I would like to see more green and white cards that don't suck shit.
Yep. I legitimately like Tristani Discordant, but that is the only one that I feel strongly about. I'll agree with Kitchen Finks with an asterisk, because obviously that card is great, but it's, I don't have to be playing both of the colors, and I'm often not.
And the last question from Nixty Bird: have you ever tried building a cube with tricolor archetypes at the center? Did it work or not, and why?
I briefly tried to design that into one of my cubes and abandoned it before I actually put it into practice. Because when it is a miss in a draft, or when those cards come up too late in the draft, they gum up the works to a significant degree, because people were not prepared to play them, or are not interested in trying to play them when they already have a successful deck going. The amount of cards you would have to do to support that would have to be its own cube entirely, and then you're more likely just playing a multicolored cube rather than a specifically 3-colored cube, because the amount of fixing you'd have to provide 3-color sections or shards or wedges or whatever you want to call them is really just an overwhelming abundance of mana fixing, which is just going to lead to multicolored Magic. That's not a bad thing, but I think 3 is tough. Like tricolor archetypes is really tough, because when you get to that many, you're just going to have a significant amount of overlap if that's something that you're trying to do in your cube comprehensively.
Yeah, 3-color gold cards are tough. I used to have 1 3-color card for every wedge or shard in Spooky Cube. That's fine, because only 1 slot, but they do sometimes just show up in drafts where nobody's going to play them. When you have 1 for every of the 10 3-color options. That's going to happen, and like at least one of them is not going to show up in every draft.
Yeah.
You want to support that more with good mana fixing, and I would go with good overlapping archetypes for 2-color pairs. For example, Orzhov Sacrifice plus Rakdos Sacrifice is how I would tackle that.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I feel the same way. I have 4 3-color cards in my cube, and these are all cards that are not, they're 3-color cards, but they're more 2-color cards that someone's like, ooh, I really want to splash that. So it's Nicol the Ravager, Corvold, Faker's King, Queen of Marchesa, Leovold, Emissary of Trest. So it's pretty small, but it fits into what like any 2-color deck would be happy to be able to splash these if they're able to. And they've all seen a pretty decent amount of play. But even still, with this few, and I have a lot of mana fixing in my cube, I still see some of these cards go late because they just sometimes just show up too late in the draft. So it's just a danger you have to face if you're trying to go down that way. All right. So now I have an email question. This is from Mark Aylett via email. My question: do you have a couple of cards for black that you feel don't see enough play in Legacy Power cubes? I've tried Reanimator and my playgroup didn't like it. Ryan must have been in your playgroup. Didn't like the feel of it all or nothing, so I removed that. I feel like black has the hardest color to balance and give a good feel for a while now, so any ideas are appreciated.
Yeah, so when you want to bring a color up to level of the other colors, if you have a more powerful cube, you want to get a good volume of individually powerful cards that are broadly playable in that color, or some themes you can shoot for. You mentioned Reanimator, something that you didn't really have success with in your playgroup. You're trying a small sack theme. I do think that the sacrifice theme is kind of your best bet, and you can actually get a pretty high volume. I think cards like Priest of Forgotten Gods are great. Pack Rat is actually just a really nice individually powerful card that's not like really overwhelming, but you'll win some games very convincingly. That's kind of actually a fun card to play with now that we're well past the point where it's ruining standard. Obviously, you're going to get Thoughtseize in most cubes. Those kind of discard spells are great. I really like Liliana the Last Hope as a card that I think is a little underappreciated how powerful it is as a standalone black card. I would play that really in any black deck that could cast it that wasn't a combo deck. I would have maybe an aggressive slant, but definitely lean heavily into the sacrifice theme. You do want to make it so if somebody has some piece of the sacrifice deck, they actually have a good shot at assembling a full deck with a bunch of cards that care about the same thing. And there's plenty of those that are just kind of generically powerful. You know, any 2-for-1 kind of spell, whether it's multiple bodies or even just a creature that gives you a little bit of value on the way down, is good to have around in your sacrifice theme.
Yep. Yeah. As Mark alluded to, says, trying a small sack theme right now. That is the way that I would go. I think that there was a long time. I actually wrote an article for Star City Games many years ago that chronicled my trouble in finding a theme in black that I was really satisfied with. And this was actually kind of strangely right around the time, and maybe directly before, maybe right after, that Avacyn Restorer came out. Notably, that's when Blood Artist came out. And since then, Black has been getting all of these additional tools for a sacrifice theme that I actually think that is Black's strongest theme. And I actually think that it's stronger than Reanimator because of the exact thing you said, that's more of an all or nothing. Ryan alluded to the play patterns not being as good. I don't feel as strongly about that, but I do think that that sacrifice in general as like a general theme for Black, dipping both into white and red, and honestly just about any other color but blue, you could make it work. I think that is the strongest thing that you can do with Black, and the way to make it the most consistent and playable across the entire color top to bottom on the mana curve. So that is what I would push. Now, I'm biased. It's also my literal favorite thing to do in Magic is play those kind of decks. But even despite my bias, I still think that is the way to go.
generally agree there. Next question was another email to you, but I'll pose it to you because it seems better fitted to something you've spoken about before. That's from Merlin Kiesel. In the past, you talked a little about different forms of protection and your stance on them. Do you try to avoid certain keywords or card types if your cube cannot really interact with them? For context, I have a mono red cube built, and I am pondering if some of the Eldrazi or a Blightsteel Colossus might be fun for a sneak attack deck. There's only Scour from Existence to deal with Indestructible, for example. Similarly, enchantments are tricky to remove, so I try to keep their count low. Do I worry too much because it's just a few cards that should be finishers? Could imagine other color or rarity limited or mechanically focused designs could have similar problems.
I think that there is a lot going on with your question, and you have nailed pretty much everything. And I think I'm going to be basically backing you up. One, I did talk about protection and my stance on them. I really dislike it in general. I think that you can have interestingly designed cards that have some sort of protection, but it's not like a broadly sweeping protection that I find interesting. I find that largely uninteresting, and I think that leads to uninteresting gameplay. Do I try to avoid certain keywords? One that I specifically try to avoid is Annihilator, like I also alluded to, or things you can't interact with. You even brought up the mono red cube, and I was talking about enchantments, which you also mentioned. So I don't actually think that you're worrying too much. I think that the things that you're saying are very realized concerns, and those are things that you do need to keep a very close eye on. Even though mono red is interesting because it has the most naturally insulated way to stop those things from happening, because it can end the game sooner than any other monocolored deck in most cases. So you have a little bit more room to play around with things that might be like high end, top of the curb, because as opposed to basically any other color, red can just make sure the game is done. So maybe there's a little bit more design space, and specifically mono red versus other monocolored archetypes or monocolored cubes that you might have. But no, I actually think you specifically need to keep an eye on those things, because those are the things that can prove problematic if there's literally almost no way. You outlined one way in your cube to deal with it, Scour from Existence. So those are things that can be runaway experiences that make it very unfun when they appear in the game.
Yeah, I generally agree. I do think that these concerns are valid. I will say that framing the Eldrazi and Blightsteel thing around sneak attack, I think that you want to lump sneak attack itself into problematic cards. That card is barely interactable itself, even less so in a red cube.
Yeah.
You have Phyrexian Revoker, maybe Pithing Needle or Sorcerer's Spyglass in the cube. Like, that card's just going to end some games or do nothing. That's kind of the range of things that sneak attack does. So I would peel it back. Things don't specifically have to say they protect themselves to have that natural protection, which you did touch on just with enchantments as a card type. But sneak attack is trying to be a game ender. So that's just something to pay attention to as well.
Yep, for sure. All right. Another email from William Booth asks, how have you and Ryan formed your cube groups and kept them together over the years? Another point of discussion will be finding people that you actually just trust with your cards. It's a good question.
Yes, definitely. And they're pretty related for me. Most of my friends that I cube with, I met from the competitive Magic scene. People I either traveled to events with or met on the road. And, you know, when you spend a lot of time on road trips in hotels together, you tend to form pretty strong bonds. And also, you know, being backpack grinder types, we tended to exchange hands on cards a lot. And the people who didn't return your cards were pretty quickly exiled from the group. So all that stuff helps to build community and to build trust. That's generally been my experience. That's a lot tougher to do now. I think that a harder question to be answered is, how in the year 2021 could you form a new cube group? We're starting to see some events come back. Not sure the pace that that's going to be at. I'm not trying to take a road trip with somebody I just met, certainly. A lot of stores, certainly at Lodestone, we have kind of a commander day. I don't think it'd be that difficult to reach out and see if you can maybe organize a cube. You probably have to do all the logistical legwork, like provide the cube yourself, and maybe even spend some time playing commander with the people there to build those friendships first. I think it's just meeting people in general is a tougher question than trust. I think that's the first hurdle of the year 2021.
Yeah, you basically nailed all of the talking points I was going to go, but I'll go through piece by piece and agree with you. I also met pretty much my entire play group through traveling to Magic events. I always, probably until pretty recently, thought of myself as a competitive player first and a casual player, whether that be commander or cube, second. And most of my friendships and people that I know in the Magic community have been through me traveling to events and them traveling to events and meeting them there. And that is how I formed a lot of my cube groups, that I would just go. And there were times that I would just go to events that I might not normally go to with just the intent to cube. Now, that doesn't help you at all. Because obviously in the year that we have had for the last 2 years, or however long it's been, who even knows anymore, getting that group together is probably very, very difficult. And I will absolutely second Ryan's opinion that your LGS is probably going to be your best friend in this case. And I would just talk with a decision maker at that store and say, hey, is it possible that I could host a cube night? And something that I've actually done before when I was trying to get people together is I would actually, and this is not going to be as fun at first, but it might help cultivate what you're saying, host the cube night, but not necessarily play yourself, and just make sure that you're cultivating the environment, helping people along, especially if they've not cubed before, so you can kind of go around and answer questions for them. And that's something that when I moved to a new city a little over a decade ago, and I didn't really know anyone there, I went and was like, hey, I'm going to cube, tell your people, and I'll run the cube draft, and then everyone can cube. I won't necessarily be a part of it, but I'll just be there. And then once I was able to do that, I got to know everybody a little bit better, because when you're not drafting and you're not playing, you can interact with everybody. And that's a really easy way to meet people and to really find out about people and probably get to know them a lot quicker than just sitting down and playing them. Because when you go to an F&M and you play 3 rounds, you're going to meet 3 people in most cases. So if you're the one running the event, you can meet 8 people. And that would be my suggestion, at least for a little bit, to make sure that you're able to cultivate, one, the experience that you want with your cube, and the personal relationships that you're looking for to try to put this group together.
All right, our next question is from Twitter. Tristan Oskin says, I've been having a lot of fun with Tuberts, make mine at 240 cards and draft 180 of them to add some variants. Do you have any opinions on Tuberts at higher than 180 cards? Do you think you'd ever make one? Do you want me to tackle this one, Justin?
I'll answer the last one. I still plan to make a Jund Tubert. I haven't done it yet, but it is a future project that I hope to handle. And when I do, I will be coming to Ryan for advice. So right now for this question, I'll also come to Ryan for advice.
All right. So I would only look at 240 if I was specifically interested in regular 6-player drafts. Only drafting 180 out of the 240. The extra variance for a 4-player draft, that's well and good. I mean, when it came to 4-player drafts previously with cubes of a size of 360 or more, I found the amount of variance in those types of drafts made a lot of the decks non-functional. So I was deliberately moving away from that variance. So I'm not interested in more cards, and I've actually really enjoyed drafting every card in a 180 card cube for 4-player drafts, and I definitely designed with that sort of thing in mind. So I don't really like the 240 card size unless you are really looking to draft 6 at least some amount of the time with it.
Okay, that's fair. All right. Brainstorm Law on Twitter asks, how would you fix black in the Magic Online Vintage or Legacy cubes?
I mean, so fix suggests that something's broken, there's a problem, right? And I think that the assumption I would make if somebody is saying it needs to be fixed would be very similar to the question we answered earlier, just regarding adjusting black for cube. And there's sort of an issue where I can see compelling cases to draft mono blue, mono red, mono green, and mono white in the Magic Online high power cubes. Mono black just doesn't really have that thematic identity. To the extent that it does, it offers Reanimator, but I'm much happier if my Reanimator deck goes into blue. And I think that the big thing that's missing, certainly from the Vintage Cube, let's see more of the Sacrifice theme. I would like to see more than just Putrid Imp in the 1-drop column. It's something that they've redone a number of times. I remember they tried like vampires at one point in the Magic Online Vintage Cube, and that wasn't so good. But I definitely think there's enough stuff going on in Sacrifice, and that'd be a good reason. That would also increase the quality. This is actually just a kind of a good broad note. When you're looking to make something work in a very high-powered cube environment, something you want to try to pull from is from a range of powerful cards that you know are powerful that maybe are not fitting the environment, that maybe could use some subsidization, and then you'll see the cards work together. Lingering Souls is a quite powerful card. It's in the Vintage Cube. It's just not that desirable, but putting in the Sacrifice theme, that's going to make it so, okay, here's this card that's like pretty powerful, doesn't really fit the environment. Now I'm a lot happier to play it. So you get to pull up some cards that are maybe on the outside looking in, and then you can really reinforce the color black. I would absolutely look at the Sacrifice theme.
Yeah, I obviously feel the same way. I will note that it's weird to me that the Magic Online cubes continue to try to like tinker with it when there is something that works. And they don't do that with like other colors that are like historically known for some like specific archetypes or strategies. It's just weird that it's like, okay, well, there finally is enough support, like for sure, for a black to be heavy into a Sacrifice theme, but it's not like ubiquitous in those cubes. I guess I just don't understand why that is. Doesn't really answer, not really providing an answer for anyone, but I'm also, I don't know why they have this answer in front of them and they're just not doing it. Yeah.
Maybe we will see it soon. I don't know. But yeah, we're not seeing it now. JPEL MTG on Twitter asks, what cards do you think are not enough classic cubes, top sleepers, if you will? I think we actually already answered that one. So I'm going to go to the next question. What are some of the coolest against the grain archetypes you've seen or implemented yourself in cubes? I mean, I would again use the example of Madness. I really enjoy that. Sometimes we see off the wall combo decks, like Ironworks combo is kind of a cool one.
Yeah.
It requires a very specific environment. I'm trying to think if there's been a particularly nice one in any of the Magic Online Spotlight cubes, but I do think that they generally do just have a lot of good stuff going on, and I haven't really been floored by an archetype. Outside of, I suppose, the amount of support that Ryan Sachs's Classic Cube had for the Persist combo decks.
Yeah.
I think that implementation was really cool.
I can definitely tell you, as I continue to try to support red-green lands as an archetype in my cube, it feels against the grain, even if it doesn't look it. Just because it's just not as good as I want it to be. But I'm going to keep trying. Or I won't. Maybe I'll abandon it again.
Yeah, one of those things.
All right. We only have a few more. I'll let Ryan take this next one.
Yeah, so next is from DDORTN Lee on Twitter. Kind of a lengthy one. So I'll just kind of summarize here. So the question is pertaining to when they design their cubes, they like to have versions of cards that you can play. Just the as printed text on the card is the Oracle text. So, Lightning Bolt says deal 3 damage to any target, that kind of thing. And avoiding cards that you have to have a lot of in-game knowledge. There's some examples of alternate frames where you don't have reminder text on keywords. You'd have something like in 10th edition, foils didn't have reminder text. So time stop, the foil is just end the turn. The non-foil is 6 lines of rules text. So you would go with the non-foil. And asking how valuable we find the approach to kind of making it so you can generally play the cards as printed, or any other barriers we might be aware of to that kind of simplicity of reading the cards and understanding what they do.
Yeah, I think those are really good examples. The good thing about Magic now is almost all cards that are like cubable are printed in multiple versions, where there's always going to be one version that has that additional accessibility. And if there's not multiple versions, that means it's a lower rarity card, and lower rarity cards are the ones that also have it spelled out. That's just something that Magic does. So like a common and uncommon, they are always going to spell out the keywords and what they do. It's only on the rares and the mythics that they don't. Now, obviously, the person asking the question knows this. So to add to that, I would try to identify specific types of cards that you want, and then find the cards that are the most similar that provide the same function. So even though you provide, they set an example, wanting to cut companions from the queues because of the errata, that's one that you can't really find a replacement for. But otherwise, I think that there are a lot of things that you can find worse versions of cards that still do what you want. And I think your cube experience will not suffer in most cases. I think it's going to be largely the same, even if the cards are still worse. The experience you want, which is anyone can pick up the cube and play it and not have to ask or find out external questions to be answered. I think that is going to be the case. And just because maybe you're playing a lightning strike instead of lightning bolt and cards like that, I still think that the experience that you're getting out of your cube is going to be largely the same.
Yeah, and I think that another example of cards that really don't fully tell you what they do and have that kind of knowledge barrier, just Planeswalkers as a card type. You just look at that card and generally how Magic works. Maybe you played in 2008. Maybe you were like a very competitive player. And you come back and you see one of those. You have no idea what that does, right? So you can't fully get away with it. And that was definitely something that the person posing this question was aware of. You can't fully get away from it. I do like trying to keep things simple. I do only play English versions of cards. I don't put textless cards in my cubes. I don't put things like expeditions where all of these Zendikar expeditions are just a bunch of hedrons and you can't tell what they are. I think if you're really concerned about people being up on what's going on, the biggest barrier I actually tends to have is when I put like a commander only card in a cube. Well, you mentioned Leilaya, the Blade Reforged, is a card that you really like. That's one of the cards that actually really turns heads in my group. Like, I have no idea what this card is. Yeah. And if you want to really make it the most accessible so you don't really have people so much reading cards, I think making the cube evocative and representative of the formats and play experience that your play group really likes, if they're really into a certain block, just play the cards of that block. And that's the way you're going to be the most accessible. You can't fully get away from the fact that Magic is an incredibly complex game. Yeah. And I like trying to pare it down a little bit. I don't think that it's very fruitful to go overboard.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah, you can't get away from Planeswalkers. That's a really good point. They're just, or you don't, and they're not going to help you if you read the cards. Mm-hmm. All right. One more real question. So how many themes is it realistic to fit into a lower number of cards in a cube that's 5 colors? Like in a tuber, is it realistic? This is at NH118 on YouTube. In a tuber, is it realistic to have every color pair be viable as a different strategy with some overlap without being simply good stuff or aggro? In my opinion, ideally draft a 10 distinct color pairs plus some build around cards planted in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you can definitely focus every 2-color pair around an archetype, and your colors can support multiple archetypes. For some longer form insights onto this, I would actually check out the article I wrote recently about modular tubers. My first modular designed tubert there to be drafted with the base model has every 2-color pair with an archetype assigned, and the gold cards for that color are all there to reinforce the assigned archetype. And then in the individual colors, you see cards that support one or more of those 2-color archetypes. I think it is not too difficult to get at least one archetype for every 2-color pair.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely possible. Obviously, you have less cards to work with, but in smaller cubes, that just means that you're going to see those cards and you actually don't have to play the cards that are like borderline playable. You just have access to all of the better cards. So I think it is definitely possible to make sure that you're paring down to get those specific archetypes really tight because of the small size of the cube.
Mm-hmm. I'm making sure that all the gold cards matter for the archetypes, I think, is the biggest note.
Exactly.
The last and possibly most important question from Danny on YouTube. Justin, how are you dealing with the return to Kamigawa?
So, all right. There was something that I might be, as far as like from Commander versus people know that I'm kind of like famously known for, is that I despise the original Kamigawa block. Absolutely hate it. I hate it to the point where it actually made me quit Magic for almost 2 years. It actually made me miss Ravnica because of its existence, so I am further frustrated by it. I hate the original Kamigawa block. That does not have anything to do with whatever set is going to come out in February, Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, other than the name. I don't hate the setting of the block. I think the setting is fine, and I think a cyberpunk future Kamigawa type deal, that sounds very cool. I think that helps with the evolution of the plane to modern day, both look, feel, and design altogether. I also feel that they know the original Kamigawa block sucked shit. It's terrible. It has a lot of problems, and I don't think that they're going to repeat any of those problems. I think what this is doing is it's satisfying all of the people that want to return to Kamigawa, but weren't there the first time to realize how much it was terrible because Commander has become so ubiquitous as format. Obviously, or hopefully, I am part of that as well. But because there's so many legendary creatures, people look back on that block way more fondly than it was in reality. So what this should hopefully do is satisfy all the people that want to go back to Kamigawa and avoid hopefully all of the pitfalls that plagued them on their first visit. So how am I dealing with the return of Kamigawa? It's the set I might be looking forward to the most in the next year. I'm really jazzed for it. And I feel like that they're going to subvert a lot of expectations because they know all of the metrics show, and I mean the money metrics, that Kamigawa was not successful. If they didn't have something wildly different planned from the first trip, I would be beyond shocked.
Yeah, really good point. Also, when we return to planes, I don't know. As a fan of Ravnica, Zendikar, and Innistrad, Return to Ravnica, Battle for Zendikar, and Shadows over Innistrad all just like missed all the notes that I like. So I'm expecting Kamigawa to be different when we go back.
Yeah,
you know, like they're gonna try different stuff.
Yeah, that's like, okay, look, it's like a literal like 2,500 years have passed. That's like meeting a baby when they're 1 year old and then meeting them 20 years later and be like, oh my gosh, you've grown. Well, no shit. Of course they have. They're an entirely different person now. That's what I'm hoping for Campbell.
Yeah, they're actually a person.
Yeah, and maybe now it will actually be a Magic set. Anyway, you can subscribe to the 540 on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon, Stitcher, YouTube, your local podcast app. Leave us a review wherever you can. I really appreciate everybody that sent in questions, and I know that Ryan does as well. This seemed pretty successful, so we will probably do it in the future. However, given the length of time we spent on this podcast, we might pare it down a little bit. So we might ask or give people either a shorter amount of time to send in questions or might have to be pickier with the questions only because we really want to answer them. But we're working overtime right now. Okay. Cedric's not going to pay me more because I talked for 2.5 hours. So, but again, I really do appreciate everyone sending in these questions. You can find me at jparnell1 on Twitter, as most of you did when you sent these questions in. And of course, my other podcast, Think Twice MTG, which you can search for anywhere you can find this one. I can also be found on Commanderverse on StarCityGames.com and YouTube every single Wednesday. Ryan, what about you?
You can find me at Ryan Overdrive on Twitter, and you can find my articles on StarCityGames.com. Believe that I should have going up maybe the same day you're hearing this, maybe Friday. But if everything goes to plan, my top 10 Innistrad Crimson Vow cards, Cube Cards article should be going live this week. So check that one out and check out my Cube articles every week on StarCityGames.com.
All right. Thank you all very much again. I think it is safe to say that our first mailbag article, I did it again one last time. I couldn't help myself before I got out. Our first mailbag podcast was a success. Thank you all very much for listening. We will be back next week with all of the Crimson Vow you could possibly handle. We'll catch you next time.